The dust had barely settled on the roads of Bursa when the morning light crept through the arched windows of the great hall, casting long golden fingers across the marble floors where generations of warriors had walked before. The air carried the weight of what was coming. Every breath drawn within those walls tasted of iron and prayer, of farewell and fate. The banners that hung from the high stone ceilings stirred in a wind that seemed to come from nowhere, as though the fortress itself was breathing, preparing, gathering its strength for what the hours ahead would bring. Sultan Orhan stood in the courtyard, his armor gleaming beneath the pale sun, his cloak draped over his shoulders like the burden of an empire that had not yet finished being born. He was not merely a man preparing for war. He was the son of Osman, the inheritor of a dream that had been planted in the soil of Anatolia like a seed watered with blood and devotion. And now that seed had grown into something that empires feared, something that kingdoms whispered about in their councils and their courts. He stood there, and the world seemed to hold its breath around him. Before the gates could open, before the drums could sound, before the horses could carry him toward whatever fate Allah had written for him in the valleys beyond, there was something he needed to do, something that no armor could protect him from, no sword could make easier. He needed to say goodbye, not the goodbye of a traveler who expects to return by nightfall. The goodbye of a warrior who knows that every battle carries within it the possibility that the sun he watches rise may be the last sun his eyes will ever witness. He walked through the corridors of the palace, his boots echoing against stone that had been worn smooth by the footsteps of those who came before him. The servants pressed themselves against the walls as he passed, their eyes lowered, their hands clasped, their hearts beating with the knowledge that their sultan was walking toward war. Some of them had been born in this palace. Some of them had watched Orhan grow from a boy who chased pigeons in the garden to the man who now held the fate of nations in his hands, and they prayed. Silently, desperately, with every fiber of their beings, they prayed that Allah would bring him back. He reached the chamber where Malhan Khatun waited. She was standing by the window when he entered, her silhouette framed by the morning light, her hands folded before her, her eyes carrying that particular quality of stillness that only comes to women who have spent their lives loving men who ride toward death. She had been the wife of Osman. She had watched the father ride out just as she now watched the son. She knew the taste of this moment better than anyone alive, the taste of swallowed tears. The taste of words that cannot be spoken because speaking them would make the fear real. Orhan approached her. He did not speak. There are moments between a mother and her son when words become unnecessary, when the language of the heart speaks louder than any tongue ever could. He took her hand, that hand which had held him as an infant, which had guided him as a boy, which had blessed him as a man, and he pressed his lips to it. He kissed her hand the way a man kisses something sacred, something irreplaceable, something that connects him to everything he has ever been and everything he hopes to become. Malhan looked at her son. She looked at this man who carried the weight of an empire on his shoulders, and in her eyes he was still the child who had once crawled into her lap during a thunderstorm, seeking shelter from a world that frightened him. She said, "May no obstacle stand in your path, my son." Her voice was steady. Her voice was the voice of a woman who had learned long ago that falling apart was a luxury she could not afford. She had cried her tears in private in the dark hours of the night when no one could see, when the walls of her chamber absorbed her sobs like old friends who had heard them many times before. But here, in the light before her son, she was stone. She was mountain. She was the foundation upon which this dynasty stood. Orhan replied that with her prayers nothing could touch him, and he believed it. He believed it not because he was naive, not because he did not understand the mathematics of war, the cruel arithmetic of swords and arrows and men who fall and never rise again. He believed it because faith is not the absence of fear. Faith is the presence of something greater than fear, and the prayers of his mother were to him a shield stronger than any forged by the blacksmiths of Bursa. Then his gaze shifted. It moved across the room the way a river changes course, naturally, inevitably drawn by a gravity that it cannot resist. His eyes found Nilüfer, and beside Nilüfer in a cradle adorned with silk and surrounded by the soft glow of oil lamps lay his son, Murad, the child who carried within his tiny body the future of everything Orhan had ever fought for. The child who did not yet know what empires were, who did not yet understand the meaning of borders and battles and the sound that a sword makes when it meets flesh. The child who knew only warmth and milk and the heartbeat of his mother. Orhan walked to the cradle. He reached down. His hands, those hands that had gripped swords and reins in the throats of enemies, those hands that had signed decrees and drawn battle plans and pointed toward horizons that needed to be conquered, those hands became impossibly gentle as they lifted his son from the cradle. He held Murad against his chest. He felt the child's heartbeat against his own, two heartbeats. One that had been beating for decades, carrying within its rhythm the memory of every battle, every loss, every victory, every prayer whispered in the darkness before dawn. and one that had only just begun, fresh and new and full of a potential that stretched beyond the boundaries of imagination. He looked at his son's face. He memorized it, the curve of the cheeks, the small nose, the eyes that blinked up at him with an innocence so pure that it almost hurt to witness. He said, "May you remain in the protection of Allah, my murad." He said it softly, the way a man speaks when he is saying something that he needs the universe itself to hear. Not a command, not a declaration, a prayer, the most sincere prayer a father can offer, the prayer that his child will live, that his child will grow. That his child will one day stand where he stands now and feel the same terrible, beautiful weight of responsibility that presses down upon his shoulders like the hand of God. He kissed his son. He breathed in the scent of his child, that scent that newborns carry, the scent of beginnings, of possibility, of a world that has not yet been corrupted by the cruelties that men inflict upon one another. And then, with a discipline that cost him more than any wound he had ever received in battle, he handed the child back to Nilufer. Nilufer took her son with hands that trembled only slightly. She held the child close and looked at Orhan and said that their children were a trust in her hands, that he should not worry about them, that he should ride with his mind clear and his heart focused. She called him her sultan, not because he required the title, not because protocol demanded it, but because in that moment she needed to remind both herself and him that he was not merely her husband, not merely the father of her child. He was the sultan, and sultans do not hesitate, sultans do not look back. Sultans ride forward into whatever storm awaits them because that is what Allah has placed them upon this earth to do. Orhan acknowledged her words. He told her that they were all in the protection of Allah first and then in the protection of one another. It was not a casual statement, it was a covenant, a declaration of the hierarchy that governed their lives. Allah first, always first, before love, before family, before empire, before self. Allah first, and then beneath that divine canopy of protection they would protect each other. They would hold each other's burdens. They would carry each other through the darkness until the light returned. And then Aspersa spoke, the Byzantine princess who had become an Ottoman bride, the woman who had crossed from one world into another, leaving behind everything she had ever known, everything that had ever defined her, to become something new, something that did not yet have a shape or a name. She said that she wished his path to be easy, that she would pray for his victory. And there was something in her voice that spoke of a longing so deep that it had no bottom, a desire to belong, to be accepted, to be seen not as the foreign woman who had been married for political advantage but as a true member of this family, this dynasty, this story that was being written in blood and faith across the pages of history. Orhan thanked her, a simple word, a single acknowledgement, but to Aspersa it was a lifeline thrown across the chasm of isolation that surrounded her. It was proof that she existed in his awareness, that her prayers mattered, that her voice had been heard. And then Orhan turned to leave. He took his first step toward the door, toward the courtyard, toward the horses and the soldiers and the long road that led to the valley where fate was waiting for him. But before he passed through the archway, he stopped. He stopped the way a man stops when something rises within him that cannot be contained, when a truth demands to be spoken, when the moment requires not just action but declaration. He turned back to face them all, his family, his soldiers, his people, the men and women who had given their lives to the cause he carried in his heart, and he spoke. He spoke of Caragirl. He spoke of the man who had proven that being a scholar of faith was not merely about reading pages from ancient books, not merely about memorizing verses and reciting them in the comfort of a warm room far from danger. Caragirl had shown them all one more time that true knowledge is lived knowledge, that the words of the prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, are not decorations to be hung upon the walls of mosques. They are weapons, they are shields. They are the foundation upon which an entire civilization is built. And they must be carried not just in the mind but in the muscle, not just in the memory but in the marrow of one's bones. Because of this, Orhan declared, from this day forward Caragirl would hold the position of Mufti of Bursa, the highest religious authority in the capital, the man whose word would be the final word in matters of law and justice and the interpretation of divine command. No longer would Caragirl ride into battle with a sword strapped to his side. His weapon from this day would be justice itself. His jihad would be fought not on the battlefield but in the courtrooms, not with steel but with wisdom, not with the strength of his arm but with the strength of his soul. The courtyard fell silent when this declaration was made, silent the way the world falls silent after thunder, when the air itself seems to vibrate with the echo of something monumental. Every soldier, every servant, every woman watching from the windows above understood that they had witnessed something rare, a sultan reshaping the architecture of his state, a leader recognizing that empires are not built by swords alone. That the mightiest fortress is not the one with the thickest walls but the one with the most just laws. Caracalla heard these words, and his eyes filled with something that was not quite tears and not quite joy but something between the two, something that exists only in the hearts of men who have been seen, truly seen, by someone they would die for. He said he accepted. He said it with the conviction of a man who knows that the path being laid before him is the path he was always meant to walk. But then his voice broke just slightly, just enough to reveal the human being beneath the scholar, and he asked for one thing. He asked to ride with his sultan one last time. One final journey. One more day of dust and danger and the brotherhood of the march. He asked because a part of him, the part that had learned to love the rhythm of hooves against earth and the weight of a sword against his hip, that part was not ready to let go. Orhan looked at Caracalla. He looked at this man who had been his companion through years of struggle, years of doubt, years of victories that tasted like exhaustion and defeats that tasted like lessons. And he understood the request. He understood it the way only a warrior can understand another warrior's reluctance to leave the battlefield, but he denied it. He denied it not from cruelty but from love, the kind of love that sees not what a man wants but what a man needs, not what serves the moment but what serves the future. He quoted the words of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. He said that the greatest jihad is to speak the truth before an unjust ruler. He said it slowly, letting each word land like a stone dropped into still water, letting the ripples spread outward until they touched every ear in the courtyard. And then he told Caracalla that from this day his jihad would be built upon justice. Not the justice of the sword, which is swift and final and often blind, but the justice of the mind, which is patient and deliberate and sees with the eyes of Allah. Caracalla lowered his head. He asked for forgiveness, not because he had sinned, not because he had done wrong, but because the act of accepting a new destiny requires the shedding of an old one, and the shedding of an old skin is a kind of death, and death always demands its rituals. Orhan embraced him. He held Caracalla against his chest the way a brother holds a brother, the way a leader holds the man he trusts with the soul of his empire. And in that embrace, something transferred between them, a charge, a responsibility, a sacred trust that could not be spoken in words but could only be felt in the pressure of arms and the beating of hearts. Forgiven, Orhan said, and with that single word the chapter closed and a new one opened. Soldiers mounted their horses. The sound of leather creaking and metal clinking filled the courtyard like a language of its own, the language of departure, the language of men riding toward a horizon that might consume them. Orhan swung onto his horse with the ease of a man who had been born in the saddle, who had learned to ride before he learned to read, who communicated with his horse through pressure and instinct and a bond that went deeper than training. He gathered the reins, he looked forward, and he rode. Behind them in the doorway of the palace, Iraz stepped forward and placed a jug of water into Spersa's hands. It was a tradition older than the stones of Bursa, older than the dynasty itself, a ritual passed down through generations of Turkic women who had watched their men ride toward war since the days when the steppes were the only home they knew. The departing warrior's path is blessed with water. Water, the source of life, poured upon the road as a prayer that the one who rides upon it will return alive. Ispersa took the jug. She stepped forward past the threshold into the light. She raised the vessel and poured the water across the dusty stones of the courtyard, watching it darken the earth, watching it flow in rivulets that caught the sunlight and turned it into silver. And she smiled, a smile that came from somewhere deep within her, from a place she had not known existed until that moment. A smile of belonging, a smile that said, I am part of this now. I am part of this family, this tradition, this story. I have poured the water, I have blessed the road, I am here. Niloufer watched from behind, and something flickered across her face that was not quite anger and not quite jealousy but something more complicated than either. Something that lived in the shadowy territory between possession and fear, between the desire to be the only one who matters and the knowledge that in the courts of sultans, no one is ever the only one. She watched Aspersa perform the ritual with the confidence of a woman who had been studying their customs, absorbing them, making them her own, and something about it felt wrong to Niloufer. Not wrong in the way that a crime is wrong. Wrong in the way that seeing someone else hold your child feels wrong, even when you know the child is safe. Wrong in the way that sharing feels wrong when you have spent your life believing that love is something that cannot be divided. Gonka spoke. She said that the princess had a great interest in learning their customs, and her voice carried the particular melody of admiration that is offered to outsiders who make an effort to become insiders. Halima agreed, adding her own observation with a sharpness that was almost admiration and almost warning, saying that the princess acted as though she had always dreamed of this life, as though she had been born for it, as though the blood of a Byzantine emperor's daughter had somehow always carried within it the seed of an Ottoman woman's soul. The words landed on Aspersa like small stones, each one precise, each one finding its mark. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She felt the familiar tightening of her chest that came whenever she was reminded that no matter how many customs she learned, no matter how many rituals she performed, no matter how perfectly she poured the water or folded her hands or lowered her eyes, she would always be the outsider. the one who came from the other side, the one whose blood carried a different history. She excused herself. She said it with dignity, with the measured composure of a woman who has been trained since birth to maintain her grace even when everything inside her is crumbling. She addressed Malhan Katan with the respect that protocol demanded, asked permission, and turned toward the stairs that led to her chambers above. Each step she climbed was a retreat from a battlefield she had not known she was fighting on until the arrows had already pierced her. Behind her, Malhan spoke to Halima. She spoke with the quiet authority of a woman who does not raise her voice because she has never needed to. She said she would not warn her again. She called her my daughter, not from biological truth but from the hierarchy of love and duty that governed their household. She told her that they must learn to live together, to coexist, to share the spaces of this palace and this family without turning every room into a battlefield and every word into a weapon. Halima received the correction in silence. There are corrections that leave bruises and there are corrections that leave seeds. Malhan's words were the latter. They entered Halima's consciousness and planted themselves there, not growing immediately but waiting, dormant, ready to sprout when the soil of her understanding was ready to receive them. Malhan followed Aspersa. She climbed the same stairs, her footsteps measured and deliberate, each one carrying her closer to a conversation that she knew needed to happen. Not the conversation of a mother-in-law disciplining a newcomer, not the conversation of a matriarch enforcing rules, but the conversation of a woman who understood, from the deepest chambers of her own experience, what it meant to be the one who did not belong. She found Aspersa in her chamber. The princess had entered the room like a storm entering a bottle, her composure finally cracking behind the closed door, her eyes burning with tears that she had refused to shed in public. She was speaking to Iraz, her voice rising and falling with the rhythm of frustration and hurt, asking what her crime was, what she had done to deserve this treatment, declaring that she had done nothing except protect her people, protect her realm, give everything she had in service of a marriage she had never asked for. Iraz tried to comfort her. She spoke with the loyalty of a servant who has become a sister, who has watched her mistress grow from a girl into a woman and loved every version of her along the way. She said that their treatment was not born from malice. She said they would grow accustomed to her presence. She said the words that friends say when the truth is too complex to be captured in simple sentences. But Aspersa was not consoled. She was drowning in the particular loneliness that belongs to women who are placed in homes where they are not chosen but assigned. Women who arrive not as brides but as treaties. Women whose wedding nights carry within them not the whispered promises of love but the cold calculus of political alliance. She said she did not know what to do. She said it with the raw honesty of someone who has reached the edge of their understanding and found nothing but emptiness beyond it. And then Malhan entered. She entered the way the moon enters a dark sky, not with force but with presence, not with noise but with light. She heard the last of Aspersa's words, the trembling declaration of helplessness, and she did not dismiss it. She did not minimize it. She did not offer the kind of hollow comfort that makes the comforter feel better while leaving the sufferer unchanged. Instead, she walked forward and said what needed to be said. "You have no fault, my daughter." 4 words. 4 words that carried within them the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent navigating the treacherous waters of dynastic marriage, of shared husbands and divided loyalties, and the constant, exhausting work of maintaining dignity in a world that treats women as the ground upon which men build their ambitions. She guided Aspersa to the bed. They sat together, 2 women from different generations, different backgrounds, different wounds, sitting on the edge of a mattress that had been stuffed with wool from the hills of Bithynia, in a room that smelled of cedar and lamp oil, in a palace that had once belonged to Byzantine governors before the Ottoman tide had washed over it and claimed it for Islam. They sat, and Malhan began to speak. She spoke of things that she had never spoken of before, not in this way, not with this rawness. She told Aspersa that the one whose trial has never been taken cannot understand the condition of the one who suffers. She said it with the authority of personal experience, with the knowledge that comes not from books but from scars. And then she revealed something that Aspersa already knew but had never heard spoken by the one who had lived it. She told her that she had been Osman's second wife. She said it plainly, without drama, without self-pity. She did not embellish the pain or diminish it. She simply stated the fact the way one states the direction of the wind or the time of the sunrise. A fact, an immovable, unchangeable fact upon which an entire life had been built. She told Aspersa that she had not come to this house as the bride of the man she loved. She had come as the bride of a realm. She had married not a man but a cause, not a husband but a destiny. She had walked through the door of this dynasty knowing that her heart's desires were secondary to the needs of the state, that her tears would water no garden but the garden of her own solitude, that her laughter would always carry within it the echo of a compromise she had made on the day she said yes to a question she had never been asked. Aspersa listened. She listened with the desperate attention of a drowning person who has been thrown a rope. She said she knew. Iraz had told her, and in her voice there was a shift subtle but unmistakable, the shift from resentment to recognition, the shift that happens when you realize that the person sitting beside you is not your adversary but your mirror, that they have walked the same road you are walking now only years before you, and the dust of that road still clings to their feet. Malhun continued. She said that being a woman in this house was one thing, being the wife of a leader was something entirely different. One could be a woman anywhere. One could cry and laugh and love and grieve anywhere. But being the wife of a sultan required something more, something that went beyond the personal, beyond the emotional, beyond the self. It required the ability to see beyond your own pain and recognize the larger architecture of the world you had been placed in. It required the understanding that your marriage was not just yours. It belonged to the state. It belonged to the people. It belonged to history itself. She said that they married not from the heart first but from the realm first. And that sentence hung in the air between them like a sword suspended by a single thread, beautiful and dangerous and impossible to ignore. It was the truth that every woman in every court of every empire throughout history has known but rarely spoken aloud. The truth that love in the halls of power is a luxury that must be earned, not a right that is given. Spersa pushed back, not with anger but with the quiet defiance of a woman who has not yet surrendered her last hope. She said she was not ready for this. She said that Malhun had at least married for a child, that her union with Osman had produced Orhan, that there had been purpose in her sacrifice. But her own situation was different. She was not a bride. She was a clause in a treaty. She was a paragraph in a diplomatic agreement. She was the human seal stamped upon a pact between two powers who needed each other but did not love each other. Orhan and Nilüfer loved each other. Everyone could see it, the way they looked at each other, the way their hands found each other in crowded rooms, the way their voices softened when they spoke each other's names. Where did that leave her? Where did that leave the woman who stood beside a love she could not share, outside a circle she could not enter, watching from the cold periphery of a warmth that would never be hers? Malhun did not flinch. She had expected this. She had lived this. She knew every corner of this particular darkness because she had wandered through it herself, fumbling, falling, rising, falling again until she had finally found the wall and followed it to the door. She said that passion and love are different things. She used words that carried the weight of poetry and the precision of philosophy. She said that passion is like flame. It burns bright, it consumes everything it touches, it turns the world to ash. It is beautiful and terrible and temporary. But love, true love, the love that sustains a marriage through decades of war and loss and children who grow and leave and sometimes die, that love is like an ember. It does not blaze. It does not announce itself with light and heat. It glows quietly deep within, steadfast and patient, giving warmth through the longest and coldest nights. She told Aspersa that once the nikah has been performed, once the sacred contract has been sealed before Allah and witnesses, the man and woman are husband and wife in the sight of God. What comes before the nikah is circumstance. What comes after is choice. The choice to build, the choice to nurture. The choice to take the raw material of an arranged union and forge it, through patience and effort and prayer, into something that resembles love, that becomes love, that eventually surpasses the fleeting fireworks of passion and becomes something so deep and so rooted that even death cannot fully sever it. She asked Aspersa if she wanted this, if she was willing to make this choice, if she was prepared to take the first step on a road that would be long and difficult and sometimes unbearably lonely, but that led eventually to a place of belonging, a place of purpose, a place where her existence would mean something not just to herself but to the world around her. Aspersa fell silent. The silence of a woman standing at a crossroads, the silence of a soul weighing its options on a scale that has no markings, no numbers, no objective measurements, the silence of choice. Malhun placed her hand over Aspersa's. The gesture was simple, skin touching skin, warmth meeting warmth, but it carried within it a universe of meaning. It said, "I am here," it said, "I understand." It said, "You are not alone," even though every fiber of your being is screaming that you are. She told Aspersa that she had two paths before her, two roads, two futures. She could spend her life mourning her fate. She could wrap herself in the cloak of victimhood and wear it until it became her skin, until she could no longer remember what she looked like without it. She could cry and rage and blame and wither, and the palace would absorb her tears the way it absorbed all tears, silently, indifferently, without even noticing. Or she could accept her destiny. She could plant her feet upon the ground of this new reality and refuse to be moved. She could become a pillar of this house, a column upon which the roof of the dynasty rested. She could transform her pain into purpose and her loneliness into strength and her foreignness into a bridge between two worlds that needed each other more than they would ever admit. Two paths, one leading to destruction, one leading to legacy, the choice was hers. Aspersa asked what she should do. The question of a woman who has chosen but does not yet know how to walk the path she has chosen. The question that comes after surrender, after the ego has finally loosened its grip and the heart has opened itself to the possibility of transformation. Malhun answered with the medicine that every wise woman throughout history has prescribed for the same illness. First, she said, you will be patient, you will watch, you will observe. You will learn the rhythms of this household the way a musician learns the rhythms of a new song, not by forcing your own melody upon it but by listening until the music enters your blood and your heartbeat synchronizes with its tempo. You will study the women around you. You will learn their fears and their strengths, their secrets and their sorrows. You will understand that no one in this house will give you your place. Your place is not something that can be given. It is something that must be built brick by brick, day by day, with your own hands and your own sweat and your own tears and your own unbreakable will. No one will give you your place, you must build it yourself. The words settled over Espersa like a mantle, heavy and warm and inescapable. She felt them sinking into her consciousness, displacing the self-pity that had pooled there, filling the empty spaces with something harder, something more durable, something that tasted not of comfort but of truth. And truth, unlike comfort, does not fade. Truth does not evaporate when the morning comes. Truth remains, stubborn and immovable, long after every other feeling has dissolved into the fog of memory. Malhun rose, she had said what needed to be said. She had planted the seed, whether it grew or withered was no longer in her hands. She walked to the door, she paused. She looked back at Espersa one final time, and in that look there was everything that words could not contain. Pride and hope and warning and love, all woven together into a single glance that lasted less than a heartbeat but carried the weight of a lifetime. And then she was gone. Espersa sat alone in the silence of her chamber. The lamp flickered, the shadows danced upon the walls, and somewhere deep within the labyrinth of her heart something shifted, something turned. Something that had been facing backward toward the life she had lost slowly, painfully began to turn forward toward the life she had not yet lived. Meanwhile, far from the palace, far from the whispered conversations of women and the politics of the harem, the world was moving toward violence. The roads of Anatolia stretched like veins across the body of the land, carrying within them the lifeblood of an empire in motion. Sultan Orhan rode at the head of his army, his horse's hooves striking the earth with a rhythm that matched the beating of his heart, steady and relentless and utterly committed to the destination ahead. The landscape changed as they moved deeper into the countryside. The cultivated fields around Bursa gave way to wilder terrain, forests of pine and oak that stood like silent sentinels on either side of the road, their branches intertwined overhead to form a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. Birds fell silent as the army passed. Animals retreated into the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to pause, as though nature itself recognized that something significant was moving through its domain. Orhan's mind was not on the beauty of the forest. His mind was in the valley ahead, the valley where his enemies waited, the valley where three powers had joined their hatred into a single fist and aimed it at his heart. He knew the terrain, he had studied the maps, he had listened to the scouts, he had walked the landscape of this battle in his imagination 100 times, 1,000 times, playing out every possible scenario, every potential ambush, every conceivable trap, and he had planned accordingly. But planning and execution are two different creatures. A plan is a drawing on parchment. Execution is the drawing brought to life, and life is chaotic and unpredictable and filled with variables that no parchment can contain. He reached the point where the road descended toward the river. The water gleamed below, reflecting the sky like a mirror laid flat upon the earth. On the other side of that water, hidden among the trees and the rocks and the folds of the terrain, his enemies waited. Daimir Khan, the man whose brother Dursun had betrayed in service of a greater strategy. The Shah, whose son lay in a condition that was closer to death than life, whose rage burned with the particular intensity of a father's vengeance. And Mahmud, the third point of this triangle of enmity, whose ambitions and grievances had brought him into alliance with men he would have otherwise despised. Orhan stopped his horse. He looked across the valley. He spoke to his commanders. He told them that the valley ahead was the trap, that their enemies expected them to ride into it the way a deer walks into a snare, blindly, foolishly, driven by momentum and the inability to see the rope until it tightens around the neck. But they would not be deer, they would be wolves, and wolves do not walk into traps, wolves spring them. He reminded them of the arrangement with Evrenos. He had ordered Evrenos to approach from the direction of Ulubad, to circle around the valley and enter from the side that the enemy would not expect, the side that they believed was protected by distance and difficult terrain. Evrenos and his men would be the jaw that closed from behind. Orhan and his men would be the jaw that closed from the front, and between those two jaws the enemies would be ground to dust. Savaş Kudai confirmed that the soldiers were in position at the valley's entrance, waiting for the signal. Boran expressed his hope that Dursun had completed his part of the mission, and Orhan said something that carried within it the full weight of his trust in the men who served him. He said he had complete faith in Dursun, not partial faith, not conditional faith, complete faith. The faith of a commander who has looked into the eyes of his soldier and seen reflected there a commitment that transcends fear, transcends self-interest, transcends even the instinct for self-preservation. He ordered everyone to proceed with caution. From this point forward, they were in a state of war. Every step could trigger an ambush. Every tree could hide an archer. Every shadow could conceal a blade. He said that their war was blessed, and the soldiers responded with a unified voice that rose from the column like a prayer sent skyward on the wings of 100 voices speaking as one. On the water, in vessels that cut through the current with the urgency of men racing against time, Evrenos and his soldiers were making their approach. The boats rocked gently as the soldiers pulled at the oars, their muscles straining beneath tunics dampened with river spray. Evrenos stood at the prow, his eyes scanning the far shore for any sign of enemy presence, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword with the casual readiness of a man who has drawn it so many times that the gesture has become as natural as breathing. He urged his men to row faster. Speed was everything. The timing of their arrival had to align precisely with Orhan's advance. Too early and they would be discovered before the trap could be sprung. Too late and Orhan's forces would face the full strength of the enemy without support. The margin for error was measured not in hours but in minutes, not in distance but in heartbeats. Temur Boga spoke of Damir Khan's men. He called them dogs, and the word carried in it not just contempt but a particular kind of hatred that is reserved for enemies who have proven themselves treacherous, enemies who fight not with honor but with deception, enemies whose victories are built on the corpses of trust. Mahmud, riding beside Evrenos, spoke with the gravity of a man who understands that the outcome of the coming hours will determine not just the result of a single battle but the trajectory of an empire. He said that the decision rested on their shoulders. He said that if they were discovered, if their approach was detected, if a single enemy scout spotted their boats and raised the alarm, the consequences would fall not on them alone but on their sultan. And there is no weight heavier than the weight of knowing that your failure will not just destroy you, but will destroy the one you have sworn to protect. Shamal answered with the confidence that warriors carry into battle like a shield, the confidence that is not the absence of fear but the refusal to be governed by it. He said that failure would not happen. He said that today they would be victorious. He said it with the absolute certainty of a man who has already decided what the outcome will be and is merely waiting for reality to catch up with his decision. And in the valley, hidden among the rocks and the scrub and the twisted trees that grew from the thin soil like fingers reaching toward a sky that offered them nothing, Damir Khan and his allies waited. They had positioned their soldiers with the meticulousness of men who have had time to prepare, who have studied the terrain and identified every advantage it offers and exploited each one. Archers crouched behind boulders. Swordsmen lay flat against the earth, their weapons beneath them, their breathing controlled, their eyes focused on the entrance to the valley where they expected Orhan to appear. Mahmud the ally spoke to Damir Khan. He spoke of Dursun, he spoke of betrayal. He said that Dursun had committed a great treachery against them but that the same treachery would serve their purposes because Dursun would bring Orhan to them. Dursun, the brother who had chosen the Ottoman side, would lead the Ottoman Sultan into this valley like a shepherd leading a lamb to slaughter, and this valley, Mahmud said, would be Orhan's end. Damir Khan agreed, but his agreement carried an edge that cut in multiple directions. He said they would deal with Orhan first and punish Dursun later. He said it with the cold efficiency of a man who has learned to prioritize his hatreds, to organize his vengeance into a schedule, to attend to each enemy in the order of their importance and then move on to the next. The Shah interjected. He spoke of his lost tribe, his wounded son, the personal cost of Dursun's actions. His voice carried the particular roughness of grief that has curdled into rage, grief that has been left too long in the darkness of the heart and has fermented into something toxic, something that poisons not just the one who carries it but everyone who comes near. Damir Khan cut through the Shah's emotions with surgical precision. He reminded everyone that they had not come here to discuss Dursun. They had not gathered their forces and positioned their soldiers and risked their lives to settle personal scores. They had come for one purpose and one purpose only: to destroy Orhan. Everything else could wait, everything else was secondary. The personal could not be allowed to contaminate the strategic. The heart could not be allowed to override the mind. Mahmud supported this position. He echoed Damir Khan's words with the skill of a politician who knows when to lead and when to follow, when to push and when to pull, when to speak and when to let silence do the work. He told the Shah that Damir Khan was right, that unity was their only weapon against an enemy as formidable as Orhan. That if they allowed their personal grievances to fracture their alliance, they would shatter against the Ottoman wall like waves against a cliff, dramatic and beautiful and ultimately futile. Daimir Khan turned to his commander, Umar. He sent him to guard Sanali. He told him to protect it if Orhan's soldiers attacked. It was a precaution, a contingency, the move of a chess player who protects his rear before advancing his front. Umar accepted the order with the unquestioning obedience of a soldier whose entire existence has been shaped by the rhythm of command and compliance. He rode out without looking back. The Shah declared that this time Orhan would not escape. He said it with the fervor of a man who has been defeated before and has spent every moment since that defeat sharpening himself for the next encounter. This time, those two words carried within them all the humiliation of past failures, all the bitterness of opportunities missed, all the accumulated hunger of a predator that has watched its prey escape one too many times. Daimir Khan ordered his soldiers to prepare for ambush. The word spread through the valley like wildfire, each soldier passing it to the next, each one adjusting his position, checking his weapon, steadying his breath. They spread out across the terrain, disappearing into the landscape the way predators disappear into the savanna, becoming indistinguishable from the rocks and the trees and the earth itself. The valley held its breath. The trap was set. The jaws were open. All that remained was for the prey to arrive. But the prey was not what they expected. And far away from the valley, far from the blood that was about to be spilled, the palace in Bursa continued its daily rhythms, unaware or perhaps painfully aware that the fate of everything depended on what was happening in the hills beyond the horizon. The women went about their duties. The servants prepared meals. The guards patrolled the walls. Life continued as it always does, even in the shadow of war, especially in the shadow of war, because life does not pause for battles. Life does not hold its breath for the convenience of men who have chosen to fight. Life goes on, stubborn and relentless and beautiful in its refusal to be interrupted by the follies and the glories of those who walk upon its surface. In the nursery, young Qasim was with his brother. His little brother Murad, the infant who did not yet know that his father was riding toward a valley where death waited with sharpened blades and loaded bows. Qasim, still a boy himself, old enough to understand duty, but young enough to express love without the filters that adulthood imposes, was playing with his brother. He leaned over the cradle and spoke to the child with the earnest tenderness that only an older brother can offer. He said, "Are you bored here, my brother?" He asked it as though the infant could answer, as though the baby's gurgling and kicking were responses in a language that only brothers could understand. He decided to take Murad out of the cradle. He decided it the way children decide things suddenly, completely, without consulting anyone, without considering consequences. He reached into the cradle and began to lift his brother, and as he did, the infant's head struck the wooden frame of the cradle, and the impact, though slight, was enough to send a shock of pain through the baby's still-forming body, and Murad began to cry. The cry of an infant is unlike any other sound in nature. It is designed by evolution to be impossible to ignore, to penetrate walls and doors and the fog of sleep, to reach into the deepest chambers of the human heart and twist. Murad's cry filled the nursery, filled the corridor beyond, spilled out through the windows and into the courtyard below. Qasim froze. He looked at his brother's reddening face, at the tears that streamed from eyes that had barely learned to focus, and he felt the particular horror of a child who has caused harm without intending to. He said, "Do not cry, my brother." He said it with desperation, as though his words could undo the impact, as though his voice could erase the pain. But Murad continued to cry. The sound rose and fell in waves, each wave carrying within it the primal distress of a being who has no other way to communicate suffering. And the sound traveled through the palace, finding ears that were attuned to it, ears that had been listening for it even when they were doing other things, ears that belonged to women whose entire existence was organized around the well-being of this child. Bursa heard the crying first, or perhaps she was simply closest. She came running into the nursery, her silk garments swirling around her legs, her face flushed with concern. She saw Qasim standing helplessly beside the cradle, she saw Murad crying, and she reacted with the instinct of a woman who, despite having no children of her own, despite being in a house where she was not yet fully accepted, could not stand idle while a baby suffered. She reached into the cradle and lifted Murad into her arms. She held him against her chest, feeling his tiny body shuddering with sobs, and she whispered to him. She called him her dear Murad, she called him her angel. She asked him why he was crying, and the question was not really a question but a song, a lullaby of reassurance spoken in the language of warmth and softness that transcends culture and religion and the accidents of birth. Outside the nursery, Nilüfer was walking through the corridor. She was thinking about Orhan. She was calculating the distance between Bursa and the valley. She was wondering whether the army had reached the river yet. She was doing what every woman does when her man is at war, the endless, exhausting arithmetic of hope, measuring time against distance, distance against danger, danger against the strength of the man she loves. And then she heard it, the cry of her son. The sound that could pull her from any depth, any thought, any preoccupation. The sound that was coded into her very biology, that activated something in her brain that was older than language, older than consciousness, older than civilization itself. She ran. She burst into the nursery with the force of a storm that has been building beyond the horizon and has finally broken free. She saw Aspersa holding her son, in the arms of another woman. The woman who had entered this family through a treaty, the woman who shared her husband's name if not yet his heart, the woman who represented everything that Nilufer feared about the future, the possibility of being displaced, of being reduced, of being made less in the eyes of the man she loved. She took Murad from Aspersa's arms. She did not ask, she did not wait. She took him with the ferocity of a lioness reclaiming her cub from a stranger, and the child, sensing his mother's familiar warmth and scent, began to quiet, his sobs diminishing to whimpers, his tiny fists unclenching, his body relaxing against the body that had carried him for 9 months. And then Nilufer saw the mark on his forehead, the red swelling where his head had struck the cradle, and in that moment all reason, all proportion, all the careful diplomacy that Malhun had been trying to teach them, all of it evaporated in the heat of maternal rage. She turned on Aspersa with eyes that could have melted steel. She demanded to know what had happened. She demanded to know what Aspersa had done to her son. Her voice was sharp enough to draw blood, accusatory enough to wound, carrying within it the implicit charge that Aspersa, the outsider, the foreigner, the one who did not belong, had harmed the thing that mattered most to her in all the world. Aspersa defended herself. She said she had done nothing. She said she had come running when she heard the crying. She said it with the desperate urgency of the innocent accused, with the rising panic that comes when you realize that the truth is not enough, that facts are no defense against the fury of a mother who sees danger in every unfamiliar hand that touches her child. Nilufer was not listening. She was not capable of listening. She was in the grip of something primal, something that predated speech and reason and the social contracts that hold civilizations together. She was a mother whose child had been hurt, and she needed someone to blame, and the someone who was standing in front of her, holding the space where her child had been, was the perfect target. She asked again what Aspersa had done to her son. She asked what Aspersa was doing in this room, in this nursery, near these children who were not hers, near this life that she had no right to touch. Aspersa pushed back. She asked what kind of person Nilufer thought she was. She asked if she was being treated as a murderer. She said it with a voice that cracked under the weight of the injustice, a voice that carried within it not just the pain of this moment but the accumulated pain of every moment since she had arrived in this palace, every whispered comment, every sidelong glance, every door that had been closed in her face both literally and figuratively. Nilufer told her to stay away from her, stay away from her children. The words were walls being built in real time, walls of mistrust and territorial instinct and the ancient, unshakable conviction that a mother's domain is sacred and any intrusion into it is an act of war. Qasim watched from the corner of the room. He watched with the wide eyes of a child who sees the adult world cracking open before him, revealing the dark things that lurk beneath the surface of politeness and protocol. He watched his mother and his father's other wife circle each other like two forces that cannot coexist in the same space without one of them being destroyed. And something in him, something that would one day grow into the wisdom of a ruler, began to understand that the battles fought within the walls of a palace are no less dangerous than the battles fought on the fields beyond them. Malhun entered. She entered the way she always entered, with the authority of inevitability, as though she had been expected, as though the room had been waiting for her the way a wound waits for a bandage. She asked what was happening. Her voice was calm but firm, a still point in the chaos that filled the room. Aspersa looked at Malhun with eyes that were swimming in tears that she would not let fall, and she said, "I did nothing." She said it twice. "I did nothing. I did absolutely nothing." And then she turned and walked out of the room. She walked out because staying would have broken her, because the next thing she said might have been unforgivable, because the line between dignity and desperation is razor thin and she could feel herself teetering on its edge. Malhun watched her go. Then she turned to Nilufer. She asked what had happened. Nilufer explained. She said she had heard her son crying and had run to find him in Aspersa's arms. She showed Malhun the mark on his forehead. She said she did not know what Aspersa had done. She said it with the righteous conviction of a woman who believes she is protecting her child, who cannot see past her own fear long enough to consider alternative explanations. And then Qasim spoke. He spoke with the trembling voice of a boy who knows that what he is about to say will shift the weight of blame from someone who does not deserve it to someone who does. He said, "I did it." He said it simply, without embellishment, without excuse. He said that he had tried to pick up his brother and that the baby's head had hit the cradle. He said it was an accident. He said it was his fault. The room fell silent, the kind of silence that follows a confession, the kind of silence that reshapes the landscape of a conversation the way an earthquake reshapes the landscape of a valley. Nilufer looked at her older son. She looked at him with the particular combination of relief and guilt that comes when you realize that the person you have accused is innocent, and the person who is actually responsible is someone you cannot bring yourself to punish. She started to speak, her voice carrying the beginning of a reprimand. "If something had happened to your brother," she said, and the unfinished sentence hung in the air like a blade that had been raised but not yet brought down. Qasim answered with the defiance of innocence. He said it was not done on purpose. He said it with the absolute moral clarity that children possess and adults have long since lost, the clarity that sees the difference between intention and accident and refuses to accept punishment for the latter. Malhun intervened. She knelt before Qasim. She spoke to him with the patient authority of a grandmother who understands that this moment is not just about a bump on a baby's head but about the lessons that will shape a future ruler. She told him that his brother was still a nursing infant, that he was fragile, that his body was still forming, still hardening, still learning to withstand the impacts of the world. She told him that he should not try to hold his brother unless there was an adult present. She said it without anger. She said it without blame. She said it as a fact, as a rule, as a boundary drawn not in punishment but in love. Qasim nodded. He accepted the rule with the solemnity of a boy who is beginning to understand that every action, no matter how small, carries consequences, and that the people we love the most are the ones we must be most careful with. Malhun told him to go sit with his brother. Qasim went. He walked back to the cradle and stood beside it, looking down at Murad's sleeping face, and in his young eyes there was something new. Not guilt exactly, not fear, but awareness. The first glimmers of the understanding that the world is more complicated than it appears, that love is not enough, that even the best intentions can cause harm, and that the mark of a good person is not the absence of mistakes, but the willingness to acknowledge them. And the palace settled into its afternoon rhythms, the crisis absorbed into the fabric of daily life the way all crises are eventually absorbed, not resolved but integrated, not healed but accommodated. Nilufer held her son and rocked him gently, her anger slowly cooling into something that resembled shame, a shame she would not voice but that would work on her in the quiet hours of the night, reminding her that she had accused an innocent woman, that she had let her fear speak louder than her fairness, that she had failed the test that Malhun had been trying to prepare them all for. Ispersa sat alone in her chamber. The tears had finally come, silent and hot, streaming down her cheeks and falling onto the silk of her dress, darkening the fabric in small circles that spread and overlapped like the ripples of stones thrown into still water. She cried not just for today, she cried for every day since her arrival. She cried for the home she had left behind, for the language she no longer heard spoken around her, for the gods she had been told to abandon, for the father who had traded her for peace, for the husband who looked through her as though she were made of glass, for the children she did not have and might never have, for the future that stretched before her like a desert, vast and featureless and offering nothing but the promise of more days exactly like this one. But even as she cried, something else was happening inside her, something that the tears were washing clean, something that Malhun's words had planted in the soil of her consciousness and that was now, watered by grief, beginning to germinate. No one will give you your place, you must build it yourself. The words echoed in her mind, repeating with each heartbeat, becoming not just a memory but a mantra, not just advice but a creed. She would build her place, she would lay the first stone tomorrow. And the next stone the day after. And the next and the next and the next, until the structure she built was so tall and so strong that no one, not Nilufer, not Halima, not Gonka, not anyone in this palace or this empire or this world, could deny her the right to stand within it. She wiped her eyes, she straightened her back. She looked at the wall of her chamber, at the stone that had been quarried from the mountains of Bithynia and laid by hands that had been dead for centuries, and she saw in it not a prison but a foundation. Her foundation, the foundation upon which she would build the rest of her life. And far away in the valley where the river caught the afternoon sun and turned it into diamonds, the armies drew closer to each other. The earth trembled with the weight of men and horses moving through the forest. The birds had long since fled. The animals had retreated into their burrows and their dens. Even the insects had fallen silent, as though the natural world itself recognized that what was about to happen in this valley was not natural at all. It was the work of men. The ancient, terrible, beautiful work of men who have decided that the only way to settle the question of who will rule and who will serve, who will live and who will die, who will be remembered and who will be forgotten, is to meet on a field of battle and let steel and blood and the will of God provide the answer. Orhan rode forward, his hand rested on his sword. His eyes scanned the treeline. His heart beat steadily, not with fear but with the calm intensity of a man who has committed himself entirely to the moment, who has released his attachment to the outcome and placed it in the hands of the one whose will cannot be thwarted by any army or any stratagem or any ambush. Evrenos and his men reached the far shore. They pulled their boats onto the muddy bank and moved into the forest like shadows spreading out in a formation that had been rehearsed until it was as natural as breathing. Each man knew his position. Each man knew the signal. Each man knew that the next few hours would determine whether he lived to see another sunrise or join the ranks of those who had gone before him, the martyrs whose names were whispered in prayers and carved into the stones of mosques that had not yet been built. The valley waited, the sun moved across the sky, the shadows grew longer, and somewhere between the forest and the river, between the ambush and the counter-ambush, between the hatred of enemies and the faith of believers, the future of an empire hung suspended like a drop of water on the edge of a leaf, trembling, uncertain, ready to fall in any direction. And in Bursa, in the palace that sat upon its hill like a crown upon a head, the women went about their lives, each one carrying her own war within her, each one fighting battles that would never be recorded in the books of history but were no less fierce, no less important, no less consequential than the battles being fought by their men in the valleys beyond. Because every empire is built on two foundations, the foundation of the sword, which is laid by men on battlefields, and the foundation of the home, which is laid by women in nurseries and kitchens and bedrooms and the quiet spaces between the walls where the real negotiations of life take place. Both foundations were being tested today. Both would hold, or both would crack. And only time, that most patient and most cruel of judges, would reveal which. The horses pressed forward through the narrowing pass. The sound of the river grew louder, a constant low roar that masked the sound of footsteps and whispered commands. Orhan raised his hand. The column behind him stopped. 100 horses, 1,000 men, frozen in an instant of discipline that spoke of training so thorough it had become instinct. He listened. The valley ahead was too quiet. The birds that should have been singing in the afternoon light were absent. The rustle of small animals that should have filled the underbrush was missing. These were the signs that every experienced warrior learns to read, the signs that the natural world provides when the unnatural presence of hidden men has disturbed its rhythms. The valley was not empty. The valley was full of men who were holding their breath, full of arrows that had been nocked and were waiting for the command to fly. Full of hatred that had been compressed into a space too small to contain it and was now pushing against its boundaries, ready to explode. Orhan knew, he had expected this. He had planned for this. But knowing and planning do not eliminate the primal tightening of the gut that comes when you ride toward men who want to kill you. They only give you the tools to manage it, to channel it, to transform it from paralyzing fear into focused action. He turned to his commanders. He spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. He told them what they already knew but needed to hear spoken aloud, the way soldiers always need to hear the obvious stated by the voice of authority, because hearing it makes it real, makes it shared, transforms individual courage into collective resolve. The enemy is there. They are waiting. They expect us to ride into the center of the valley and be surrounded. We will not give them what they expect. We will give them what they deserve. The plan was already in motion. Evrenos was already moving through the forest on the far side of the valley, his men spreading like water through the crevices of the terrain, finding the gaps in the enemy's formation, positioning themselves for the strike that would come from the direction the enemy was not watching. The hammer and the anvil, the oldest stratagem in the history of warfare, simple in concept, devastating in execution, and the key to its success was timing, the timing of a heartbeat. The timing of a prayer. Somewhere in the valley, Damir Khan shifted in his position. He had been crouching behind a boulder for hours, his legs cramping, his patience fraying. He was a man accustomed to action, to the direct confrontation, to the charge and the clash and the visceral satisfaction of meeting an enemy face to face and watching the light leave his eyes. This waiting was torture. This hiding was beneath him. But he endured it because the stakes were too high for pride, because the man he was hunting was too dangerous for anything less than the perfect trap. The Shah crouched beside him, his aging body protesting the position, his joints aching with the particular rebellion that old bones mount against the demands of war. But his eyes were young. His eyes burned with the fire that had been kindled by the injury to his son, the fire that would not be extinguished by anything less than the blood of the man he held responsible. He gripped his sword with hands that knew its weight the way a musician knows the weight of his instrument, intimately, instinctively, each finger finding its place on the grip without conscious thought. And between them, Mahmud waited with the calculating patience of a man who fights not from passion but from strategy, not from hatred but from ambition, not because he wants to destroy but because he wants to build, and the first step of his building requires the removal of the obstacle called Orhan. The minutes stretched like leather being pulled across a drum, tight and taut and vibrating with tension. Every sound was amplified, every movement was magnified. A twig snapping somewhere in the forest sent a ripple of alertness through the hidden soldiers. A bird taking sudden flight from a tree caused hands to tighten on weapons and eyes to narrow toward the source. The valley was an instrument tuned to its highest pitch, waiting for the hand that would strike the first note of the symphony of war. And in the forest on the far side, Evrenos paused. He held up his hand. Behind him, his men froze, becoming part of the landscape, indistinguishable from the trees and the rocks and the shadows that played upon the forest floor. He had heard something. Or rather, he had felt something, that instinct that develops in men who have spent their lives in combat. The sixth sense that detects danger not through the conventional five senses but through some deeper, more ancient mechanism, the mechanism that tells the prey the predator is near, that tells the hunted the hunter is close. He looked through the trees. He saw them. Damir Khan's soldiers, positioned along the ridge that overlooked the valley floor, their bows at the ready, their attention focused entirely on the entrance to the valley where they expected Orhan to appear. They were not looking behind them. They were not guarding their rear. They had made the oldest mistake in warfare. They had assumed that the direction they were watching was the only direction from which danger could come. Evrenos smiled. It was not the smile of amusement. It was the smile of the craftsman who sees that his work has been done well, that the pieces are in place, that the moment of completion is approaching. He signaled to his men. The signal passed from man to man like a whisper traveling through a crowd, each soldier receiving it and passing it on without a sound, without a visible gesture, through the subtle language of trained warriors who have learned to communicate in the spaces between movements. They waited for the sound that would come from the valley entrance, the sound that would tell them Orhan had begun his advance, the sound that would be their cue to close the trap. And on the other side of the valley, at its entrance, Orhan drew his sword. The blade emerged from its scabbard with a whisper of steel against leather, a sound that was, to every man in his army, the most beautiful sound in the world. The sound that meant the waiting was over, the sound that meant the doing had begun. He held the sword high, and the afternoon sun caught the blade and threw its light across the faces of his soldiers, illuminating them, baptizing them, marking them as men who had been chosen for this moment, who had been placed on this particular piece of earth at this particular moment in time for a purpose that was greater than any of them individually, but that required all of them collectively. He did not shout, he did not give a rousing speech. The time for speeches had passed, the time for action had arrived. He simply lowered the sword, pointing it toward the valley, and kicked his horse forward. The army moved. Like a river that has been dammed and is finally released, the Ottoman force poured into the valley with a force that shook the earth and filled the air with the thunder of hooves and the clatter of armor and the war cries of men who had placed their lives in the hands of God and were now charging toward whatever destiny he had written for them. The sound was enormous. It rolled across the valley like a physical thing, crashing against the walls of the ravine, echoing off the cliffs, reaching the ears of every hidden soldier on every ridge and in every hollow. Damir Khan rose from behind his boulder, his face twisted with savage satisfaction. He raised his arm and the signal was given and his archers let fly and the sky darkened with arrows, hundreds of them, thousands of them, a deadly rain descending upon the advancing Ottoman column with the indifferent precision of a natural disaster. Shields rose, the sound of arrows striking leather and wood and metal filled the valley like hail striking a tin roof. Men fell, horses screamed. The first blood of the battle was spilled on the valley floor, darkening the earth, feeding the soil with the iron-rich testimony of sacrifice. But the Ottoman advance did not falter. It did not slow. It continued with the relentless momentum of a force that has been trained to absorb punishment and keep moving, to accept losses and maintain formation, to turn pain into fuel and fear into fury. Orhan rode at the front, his shield raised, his sword ready, his eyes fixed on the ridgeline where the archers crouched, counting the seconds until they were close enough to charge the positions, close enough to turn this from a ranged battle into a melee, close enough to negate the advantage of the bow and bring the war to where the Ottoman strength lay, in the close-quarter combat, in the blade work, in the savage intimacy of fighting at arm's length where courage matters more than numbers. And then, from behind the enemy lines, from the direction no one was watching, from the forest that had been assumed to be empty and harmless, came the sound that changed everything. The sound of Evrenos and his men emerging from the trees like wolves from a night forest, their war cries splitting the air, their swords catching the last light of the afternoon sun, their horses charging down the slope with the unstoppable force of an avalanche. They hit Damir Khan's rear positions like a fist hitting glass, shattering the formation, sending archers tumbling from their perches, turning organized ranks into chaotic clusters of men who suddenly found themselves fighting on two fronts. The trap had been sprung, but not the trap that Damir Khan had set. The trap that Orhan had designed, the trap within the trap, the ambush of the ambushers. The valley erupted into chaos. The sound of steel meeting steel, of men shouting and screaming and dying, of horses colliding and falling and rising again, filled every corner of the space with a noise so overwhelming that it seemed to have a physical weight, pressing down on everything, making it impossible to think, impossible to plan, impossible to do anything except fight and survive and fight some more. And in the midst of it all, Orhan fought. He fought with the controlled fury of a man who has been trained for this since before he could remember, whose muscles have been shaped by years of daily practice, whose reflexes have been honed by countless sparring sessions and real battles until the act of fighting has become as automatic as breathing. His sword rose and fell and rose again, each stroke precise, each movement economical, nothing wasted, nothing theatrical, just the clean, efficient violence of a warrior doing what warriors do. The battle raged. And in Bursa, in the palace on the hill, the sun began to set. The shadows lengthened. The lamps were lit. The women gathered for the evening meal that none of them would eat because eating requires an appetite and appetite requires the absence of dread, and dread was the only thing any of them could feel, sitting around a table laden with food they could not taste, surrounded by silence they could not break, waiting for news that might not come for hours or days or ever. Malhun sat at the head of the table, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, her face carrying the expression of a woman who has waited for men to come home from battle so many times that the waiting has become a skill, a discipline, a form of worship. She did not fidget, she did not pace. She did not voice the fear that lived in her chest like a second heart, beating out of rhythm with the first, pumping not blood but anxiety through her veins. She simply sat and waited and prayed. Nilofer held Murad against her shoulder, patting his back gently, rhythmically, the way mothers do when they are soothing their children but are really soothing themselves. The baby had fallen asleep, his small body warm and heavy against her, his breathing deep and even, his face peaceful with the particular serenity that belongs to those who are too young to know that the world is a dangerous place. She envied him. She envied the completeness of his ignorance, the perfection of his unawareness. She wished she could return to that state, even for a moment, even for a single breath, the state of not knowing, not worrying, not imagining every possible outcome and being destroyed by each one. Ispersa sat apart. She sat by the window, looking out at the darkening sky, her reflection ghostly in the glass, her thoughts traveling the distance between the palace and the valley at the speed of light, arriving at the place where the battle was being fought and finding nothing there but the darkness of her own ignorance. She did not know if Orhan was alive. She did not know if the battle had been won or lost. She did not know anything, and the not knowing was worse than any knowledge could have been, because the imagination, when deprived of facts, creates its own, and the facts it creates are always the worst possible ones. Halima and Gonka sat together, their heads bowed, their lips moving in silent prayer, their fingers working through prayer beads that had been worn smooth by years of use. Each bead a word, each word a plea, each plea a rope thrown toward heaven in the hope that it would catch on something and pull their men back from the edge of oblivion. Qasim sat in the corner, his knees drawn up to his chest, his eyes wide and watchful. He was old enough to understand that something terrible might be happening, old enough to feel the weight of the silence that filled the room like water filling a sinking ship, old enough to wonder for the first time in his young life whether his father would come home. And in that wondering, in that first encounter with the possibility of loss, something in him changed forever. The child he had been that morning was not the child he would be tomorrow. The experience of waiting for a father who might not return had taken something from him, something innocent and irreplaceable, and had given him in its place something harder, something that would grow over the years into the particular kind of strength that belongs to men who have learned, early and thoroughly, that nothing in this world is guaranteed. The night deepened. The stars appeared one by one, pinpricks of ancient light piercing the velvet darkness, indifferent to the suffering below, indifferent to the blood being spilled in the valley, indifferent to the tears being shed in the palace, indifferent to all of it, because stars do not care about the affairs of men. They burn. That is all they do. They burn and they watch and they say nothing. And in the valley, the battle continued. Not with the initial fury of the first clash, but with the grinding, exhausting persistence that characterizes the later stages of combat. When the adrenaline has been spent and the muscles are burning and the throat is raw from shouting, and the hands are slippery with blood and sweat, and the only thing keeping you moving is something deeper than energy, deeper than will, something that lives in the very marrow of your bones and refuses to let you stop, refuses to let you fall, refuses to let you surrender to the darkness that beckons from every direction. Men fought, men fell, men rose, men fell again and did not rise. The valley floor became a carpet of bodies, Ottoman and enemy alike, their blood mingling in the dirt, becoming indistinguishable, because blood, unlike the men from whom it flows, does not recognize borders or allegiances or the reasons that men kill each other. Blood is blood. It is all the same color. It makes the same sound when it hits the ground. It dries in the same shade of brown when the sun finds it in the morning. Orhan was wounded. A blade had found the gap between his armor and his vambrace, drawing a line of fire across his forearm that bled freely and steadily, soaking the leather of his glove and making his grip on his sword treacherous. He ignored it. He ignored it the way a man ignores a mosquito bite during an earthquake. The wound was real. The pain was real. But the battle was more real, and the battle demanded every ounce of his attention, every fraction of his focus, and there was nothing left over for the luxury of acknowledging pain. Evrenos fought on the far side of the valley, his men pushing deeper into the enemy's broken formation, driving them toward the center where Orhan's forces waited like an anvil waiting for the hammer. The enemy soldiers caught between two forces began to break, not all at once, not in a dramatic collapse, but in the slow, incremental unraveling that happens when men realize that the situation is hopeless, when the mathematics of survival change from difficult to impossible, when the animal brain overrides the warrior brain and screams the oldest command in the biological lexicon: run. Some ran, they threw down their weapons and fled into the forest, crashing through the underbrush with the blind desperation of creatures fleeing a fire. Some fought on, driven by loyalty or rage or the simple inability to accept that the day was lost. And some fell to their knees and raised their hands, surrendering, offering their lives to the mercy of their conquerors, betting that an Ottoman prison was better than an enemy grave. Damir Khan did not run. He fought with the savage intensity of a man who knows that defeat means death and death means the end of everything he has built, and everyone he has sworn to protect. His sword was an extension of his rage, striking and striking and striking at the Ottoman soldiers who surrounded him, each blow powered by the furnace of his fury, each swing buying him another second of existence in a world that was rapidly running out of seconds to give. The Shah fought beside him, his old body performing feats that should have been beyond its capacity, driven by the memory of his son's broken body, by the image that had been burned into his mind like a brand, the image of his boy lying in a bed, alive but not living, breathing but not truly present, a ghost trapped in flesh, a punishment worse than death because death at least has the mercy of finality. And Mahmud fought with the cold precision that was his signature, every movement calculated, every engagement assessed for risk and reward, fighting not to win the battle which he could already see was lost, but to survive it because survival was its own victory, and a man who survives today can fight again tomorrow. And the war, the real war, the war for supremacy and legacy and the future of nations, that war was far from over. The battle wound down like a clock running out of spring. The sounds diminished, the clashes became less frequent, the screams faded into moans and then into silence. The valley, which had been alive with violence for hours, slowly, reluctantly returned to something resembling peace. But it was not real peace. It was the exhausted stillness that follows catastrophe, the silence of a body that has been beaten until it has nothing left to say. Orhan stood in the center of it. He stood among the fallen, among the blood and the broken weapons and the silent bodies that lay scattered across the valley floor like leaves after a storm. His armor was dented. His face was streaked with dust and blood. His arm throbbed where the wound wept steadily, dripping red onto the earth at his feet. But he was standing, he was alive, he had survived. Around him, his soldiers gathered. They were battered and bleeding and exhausted beyond the capacity of language to express, but they were alive and they were victorious, and the knowledge of their victory was slowly, like dawn breaking over a dark horizon, beginning to illuminate their faces with something that was not quite joy but was its distant cousin, the grim satisfaction of men who have passed through the fire and emerged on the other side. Evrenos approached. He was limping. A wound to his thigh had been hastily bandaged with a strip torn from his cloak, the fabric already dark with blood. He stopped before Orhan. He did not smile, he did not congratulate, he simply nodded. The nod of one warrior to another. The nod that says, I was there and you were there and we both know what it cost and we will never speak of it because speaking of it would diminish it. Orhan returned the nod. And then he looked around at the valley. At the battlefield that had been a trap set for him by men who had underestimated him, who had seen in him a young sultan and mistaken youth for weakness, who had seen a rising power and mistaken its smallness for vulnerability. They had set their trap, and he had sprung it, not on them exactly but around them. He had used their own strategy against them, turning their ambush into his ambush, their valley of death into their own grave. But the enemy leaders had escaped. Damir Khan had vanished into the forest during the final chaos of the rout. The Shah had been seen riding north, surrounded by a handful of loyal soldiers, his old body somehow still upright in the saddle. Mahmud had simply disappeared, as men of his particular skills always do, dissolving into the confusion of battle like smoke dissolving into air. They were alive, they were out there, they were defeated but not destroyed. And a defeated enemy who is not destroyed is not an enemy who has been overcome. He is merely an enemy who has been given a reason to hate you more deeply, to plan more carefully, to wait more patiently for the next opportunity to strike. Orhan knew this. He knew it with the deep, visceral understanding of a man who has been fighting his entire life and who knows that the end of one battle is merely the beginning of the next. The war was not over. The war would not be over for a long time. Perhaps the war would never be over. Perhaps that was the nature of the task that Allah had placed upon the shoulders of his family, the task of building something that had never existed before, something that would require generations of blood and sacrifice and faith to complete. He sheathed his sword. He mounted his horse. He looked toward the horizon, toward Bursa, toward the palace where his family waited, where his mother's prayers still echoed in the empty courtyard, where his wife still held his son against her shoulder, where his second wife still sat by the window watching the stars. He would return to them. He would walk through the gates of his capital with the dust of battle still on his boots and the blood of his enemies still drying on his blade. He would hold his son. He would kiss his mother's hand. He would sit in his chamber and stare at the ceiling and listen to the silence and try to remember what it felt like to be a man who did not carry the weight of a world on his shoulders. But not yet. Not yet because the wounded needed tending. Not yet because the dead needed burying. Not yet because the prayers of thanksgiving needed to be spoken there on the battlefield, in the valley where the blood of believers had been spilled in the service of a cause that was greater than any individual life. Not yet because there were orders to be given, scouts to be sent, perimeters to be established, prisoners to be secured. Not yet because a sultan's work is never finished. A sultan does not have the luxury of rest. A sultan carries his throne on his back wherever he goes, and the throne is heavy and the back aches, and there is no one in all the world who can share the burden. He turned his horse. He rode back into the valley. He began the work that follows every battle, the unglamorous, heartbreaking, necessary work of picking up the pieces. And as he worked, as he knelt beside wounded soldiers and pressed bandages against wounds and spoke words of comfort to men who were dying and words of encouragement to men who would live, the sun began to set behind the western hills, painting the sky in shades of red and orange and gold that were, in a terrible and beautiful coincidence, exactly the colors of the blood that stained the valley floor. The day was ending, the battle was won. But the war continued. It continued in the forests where Daimir Khan fled with murder in his heart. It continued in the northern roads where the Shah rode with vengeance burning behind his eyes. It continued in the shadows where Mahmud calculated and planned and waited. It continued in the palace where women fought their own battles with weapons that left no visible wounds but cut just as deeply. It continued in the nursery where a baby slept, unaware that his name, Murad, meant desire, meant wish, meant the thing for which you ache, and that the world into which he had been born would ache for everything he would one day become. The war continued. And the empire, that young and fragile and impossibly ambitious thing, that dream planted in the soil of Anatolia by a man named Osman and watered with the blood of his descendants, that empire continued too, growing, reaching, stretching its roots deeper into the earth and its branches higher toward the sky. Not yet an empire, perhaps. Not yet the colossus that it would one day become, the power that would make the walls of Constantinople tremble and the thrones of Europe shake and the history of the world pivot on its axis. Not yet, but becoming, always becoming, moving toward a destiny that could be felt but not yet seen, heard but not yet understood, believed but not yet proven. The night fell, the stars watched, the valley slept beneath its blanket of blood. And somewhere on the road between the battlefield and the palace, a lone rider galloped through the darkness, carrying news that would set hearts racing and eyes weeping and voices crying out in gratitude to a God whose plans are mysterious, and whose mercy is infinite, and whose war, like the war of the men and women who serve him, is never truly over. Never truly over. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not until the last page of the last book has been written by the last hand that holds a pen. And even then, the echo of what happened in that valley, in that palace, in that nursery where a baby's head struck a cradle, and a woman poured water on a dusty road, and a sultan kissed his mother's hand before riding toward a fate that only God could see, even then the echo would continue. Because some stories do not end. They simply wait for the next voice to tell them. The messenger arrived before dawn. His horse collapsed beneath him as he crossed the threshold of the palace gates, its legs folding like paper, its great lungs heaving their final breath into the cold morning air. The animal had been ridden beyond its limits, driven across distances that should have taken days and mere hours. Its heart burst not from cruelty but from the urgency of what its rider carried. News, the most precious and most dangerous cargo that any rider can bear. News that could not wait for the sun to rise. News that had to pierce the darkness and find its way to the ears that needed to hear it. The guards found the messenger slumped over the fallen horse, his body so depleted that he could barely lift his head, his lips cracked and bleeding from the wind that had whipped his face throughout the night ride, his hands still clutching the reins of a horse that would never run again. They carried him into the guardhouse. They poured water down his throat. They waited for the words that he had sacrificed everything to deliver. "Victory," he whispered, "the Sultan lives, victory in the valley." The words spread through the palace like fire through dry grass, from the guardhouse to the servants' quarters, from the servants' quarters to the kitchens, from the kitchens to the corridors, from the corridors to the chambers where the women had spent the night not sleeping, not eating, not doing anything except waiting and praying and imagining every possible outcome, each one worse than the last. Malhun Khatun received the news in her private chamber where she had been sitting since midnight, her prayer beads worn smooth by the constant motion of her fingers, her lips moving in an endless whispered conversation with the Almighty. The servant who brought the message knelt before her, trembling, uncertain whether to speak or wait, uncertain what protocol demanded in a moment when protocol seemed suddenly absurd, when the rigid structures of court etiquette dissolved before the raw human need to share news of life in the face of expected death. "Speak," Malhun said. Her voice was steady. It had been steady all night. It would remain steady now because that was what she had learned over decades of waiting for men to come home from battle. Steadiness was not the absence of fear. It was the refusal to let fear speak louder than faith. The servant spoke, "The Sultan is victorious. He is returning. The enemy has been routed." Malhun closed her eyes. She did not weep. She did not cry out. She simply closed her eyes and let the news wash over her like warm water, let it seep into the places that had been tight with dread and soften them, let it fill the spaces that had been hollow with fear and make them whole again. She sat like that for a long moment, her eyes closed, her breathing slow and deep, her hands finally still upon her lap. And then she opened her eyes and said, "Prepare the palace. The Sultan is coming home." The palace erupted into activity. Servants who had been frozen in the paralysis of uncertainty suddenly found their purpose again, rushing through corridors, carrying linens and medicines and food, preparing chambers that had been cold and dark for days, lighting fires in hearths that had gone untended, opening windows to let the morning air chase away the stale breath of worry that had accumulated in every room. In her chamber, Nilufer received the news while holding Murad against her chest, the baby finally sleeping after a night of restlessness, as though even his infant soul had sensed the danger that threatened his father and had been unable to find peace until the danger had passed. She heard the words, and the tears came, the tears she had been holding back all night, the tears she had forbidden herself to shed because shedding them would have felt like giving up hope, like accepting that the worst had already happened. Now the worst had not happened. Now the tears could fall, not in grief but in relief, in gratitude, in the overwhelming release of pressure that had built behind her eyes like water behind a dam. She wept. She held her son and wept, her tears falling onto his sleeping face, mixing with the warmth of his skin, baptizing him in the salt of her relief. She wept until there were no more tears, until the well had been emptied, until she was hollow and light and ready to be filled again with something other than fear. In her chamber by the window, Espersa heard the commotion before she heard the news. She had been awake all night, unable to sleep, her mind traveling the distances between the palace and the battlefield, imagining and reimagining what might be happening in the valley where her husband fought. She had not yet learned to call him that in her heart, husband. The word still felt foreign on her tongue, like a garment that had been made for someone else's body and given to her to wear regardless of how poorly it fit. But she had married him. Before God and witnesses, she had become his wife. And wives pray for their husbands, even when the husbands are strangers, even when the marriages are treaties, even when the love has not yet found its way into the spaces between the obligations. She had prayed. She had prayed with the formal words she had been taught since childhood, the prayers of her Byzantine heritage that she still remembered even though she had been instructed to forget them. And she had prayed with the new words, the Arabic phrases that she was still learning, the Muslim prayers that felt awkward in her mouth but that she practiced anyway because this was her life now, this was her family now, this was her God now, and she would learn to speak to him in the language he preferred. And now the prayers had been answered, or perhaps they had simply coincided with an outcome that had been decided before any prayer was uttered, by forces and calculations that operated on levels far beyond human supplication. She did not know which, she did not care which, all that mattered was that Orhan was alive, all that mattered was that he was coming home. All that mattered was that she would have another chance, another day, another opportunity to build the place that Malhun had told her she must build. She rose from her seat by the window, she called for Iraz, she said, "Help me prepare, I must look my best when the Sultan returns." Iraz looked at her mistress with something that might have been pride and might have been hope and might have been the simple satisfaction of seeing a broken thing begin to mend itself. She said, "Yes, my lady," and she began to prepare. The morning unfolded in a fever of preparation. The kitchens worked through dawn and into the day, producing the dishes that would welcome the returning army, the meats and breads and sweets that soldiers dream of when they are lying in fields far from home with only hardtack and water to sustain them. The servants cleaned and polished and arranged until every surface gleamed and every corner was immaculate, and every room was ready to receive not just a sultan but a conqueror. But beneath the activity, beneath the relief and the joy and the frantic preparations, something else was stirring. Something that had been born in the night and was now growing in the morning light, feeding on the particular combination of exhaustion and emotion that follows any crisis. Something that would, in the days to come, prove to be as dangerous as any enemy army. Resentment. It lived in the glances that Nilüfer directed at Aspersa whenever their paths crossed. It lived in the whispered conversations between Halima and Gonka that stopped suddenly whenever someone else entered the room. It lived in the small territorial disputes over who would stand where when the Sultan arrived, who would speak first, who would be acknowledged first, who would receive the first look from those eyes that all of them in their different ways had been waiting to see again. The war in the valley was over, the war in the palace was just beginning. And in the valley itself, far from the palace and its politics, the grim work of aftermath continued. The sun rose over a landscape transformed by violence, illuminating with pitiless clarity the cost of the victory that had been won. The valley floor was carpeted with bodies, Ottoman and enemy alike, their limbs intertwined in the intimacy of combat that death had preserved, their eyes staring at a sky they could no longer see. Flies were already gathering. The sound of their buzzing filled the morning air with a drone that would grow louder as the day warmed, and the bodies began their inevitable journey back to the earth from which they had come. Orhan walked among the fallen. He had not slept. He would not sleep until every Ottoman soldier had been accounted for, until every wounded man had been tended, until every dead man had been identified and prepared for the burial rites that their faith demanded. This was the part of war that the ballads never sang about, the part that the poets omitted from their verses. The part that happened after the swords were sheathed and the battle cries had faded, and all that remained was the silence of the dead and the groans of the dying. He stopped beside a young soldier, a boy really, perhaps 17 years old, perhaps younger. His face still carried the softness of youth that hardens into manhood only through the accumulation of years and experience. But he would accumulate no more years, he would gain no more experience. He lay on his back with his hand still wrapped around the hilt of his sword, his eyes open, his expression frozen in something that might have been surprise and might have been peace and might have been nothing at all, just the random configuration of muscles relaxing into death. Orhan knelt beside him. He closed the boy's eyes with a gentleness that would have surprised anyone who had seen him fighting in the same valley just hours before. He spoke a prayer softly, the words meant not for anyone else to hear, but for the ears of the Almighty and perhaps for the soul of this boy who had given everything he had in service of a cause he believed in. He did not know the boy's name. He would learn it later from the rosters, from the commanders who would report their casualties with the grim efficiency that war demands. He would learn that this boy had been from a village near Eskişehir, that he had been the oldest son of a farmer, that he had joined the army because he believed in the dream of what the Ottomans were building, that he had written letters to his mother that she would now never read, that he had spoken of one day returning home with honor and glory, and instead would return home in a shroud, carried by soldiers who would hand him to his family with words of condolence that could never fill the hole his absence would leave. Orhan would learn all of this, and he would carry it. He would carry this boy and every other boy who had fallen in this valley, carry them in the spaces of his heart that were reserved for the weight of command, the spaces that grew heavier with each battle, that would grow heavier still in the years to come, that would one day be so full of the dead that there would be no room left for anything else. But that was for later. For now, he simply knelt beside the boy and prayed, and then rose and moved on to the next body and the next, walking the valley of death like a shepherd walking among his fallen flock. Evrenos found him there, hours later, still walking, still praying, still carrying the weight. The sun was high now and the heat was rising and the smell of death was becoming impossible to ignore, that sweet sick smell that every soldier learns to recognize and that no soldier ever forgets. Evrenos approached with the slow gait of a man whose wound had stiffened overnight, whose leg protested every step but whose will refused to acknowledge the protest. "My Sultan," he said, "the burial details are organized. The wounded have been transported to the field hospital. The prisoners are secured." He paused. "You should rest." Orhan did not look up from the body beside which he was kneeling. "Rest," he repeated. The word sounded foreign, as though it belonged to a language he had once known but had forgotten. Evrenos pressed on. The men need to see you strong. They need to know that their sultan is well. Exhaustion serves no one. Orhan finally looked up. His face was lined with fatigue and something else, something that Evrenos recognized because he had seen it before in the faces of commanders who had witnessed too much, who had ordered too many men to their deaths, who had felt the weight of responsibility pressed down upon them until they were not sure if they would ever be able to stand straight again. How many? Orhan asked. How many of ours? Evrenos hesitated. The number was not final. The count was still being conducted, but an estimate had been reached, a rough calculation based on the reports that had come in throughout the night. He spoke the number. He spoke it flatly, without emotion, because speaking it with emotion would have been unbearable. Orhan received the number. He received it like a blow, absorbed into the body, processed by the mind, stored in the heart. He did not flinch, he did not weep. He simply received it and added it to the weight he already carried, the weight that would never grow lighter, that could only ever grow heavier. That was the price of the crown he wore. The crown that was invisible but that pressed down upon his brow with a pressure that no amount of victory could relieve. And the enemy? He asked. Evrenos spoke another number. This one was larger, much larger. The ambush that had been intended for Orhan had been turned upon the ambushers with devastating effect. Daimir Khan's forces had been broken. The Shah's men had been scattered. Mahmud's contingent had evaporated into the hills. The coalition that had been assembled to destroy the Ottomans had itself been destroyed, or at least so badly damaged that it would take months, perhaps years, to rebuild. But the leaders escaped, Orhan said. It was not a question. Evrenos nodded. Daimir Khan was seen fleeing north. The Shah went west toward his own territories. Mahmud's whereabouts are unknown. Orhan stood. The movement was slow, his muscles protesting, his body demanding the rest that his mind refused to allow. He looked out across the valley, across the carpet of bodies that would soon be buried, across the blood-soaked earth that would soon be washed clean by rain and time and the relentless cycle of nature that cared nothing for the affairs of men. They will return, he said. They will lick their wounds and nurse their hatred, and they will return. This battle was a victory, but the war continues. Evrenos did not argue. There was nothing to argue about. They both knew the truth. They had known it before the battle, and they knew it even more clearly now that the battle was over. The enemies of the Ottoman state would not disappear simply because they had been defeated once. They would retreat, they would regroup, they would form new alliances and devise new strategies and wait for the next opportunity to strike. And the Ottomans would have to be ready, always ready, forever ready. That was the price of building something new in a world that preferred the old, of rising in a world that preferred you to stay down. Orhan turned to Evrenos. We march for Bursa tomorrow, he said. The men need rest tonight, but tomorrow we go home. Evrenos nodded. And then, because he was not just a commander but a friend, because he had known Orhan since before he was sultan, since he was just a prince learning to ride and fight and lead, he added something that protocol did not require but that friendship demanded. You did well, he said. Your father would be proud. Orhan did not respond. He did not know how to respond to a statement like that, a statement that reached into the deepest chambers of his heart and touched the wound that lived there, the wound that had never healed, the wound that was called Osman. His father, the giant whose shadow he lived within, whose legacy he carried, whose dream he was trying to build into reality one blood-soaked battle at a time. He simply nodded, a slight inclination of his head that could have meant anything and meant everything, and then he walked away, back into the valley, back among the dead, back to the work that was not finished and would not be finished until every last fallen soldier had been honored with the rights they deserved. The day passed in labor. The soldiers dug graves in the hard earth of the valley, their shovels breaking through soil that was rocky and resistant, that seemed to resent the intrusion of the dead into its depths. They wrapped bodies in shrouds that had been carried for this purpose, white cloths that covered the faces of the fallen, and gave them a uniformity in death that they had not possessed in life. They spoke prayers over each grave, the words repeated so many times that they became a rhythm, a heartbeat, a constant presence that filled the valley with something that was almost like peace. And as the sun began to set, as the western sky turned red and orange and gold in what seemed like a cosmic echo of the blood that had been spilled, the burials were complete. The graves were filled. The markers were placed. The valley that had been a battlefield was now a cemetery, a sacred ground where Ottoman soldiers would sleep until the day of judgment, when they would rise and stand before the Creator and give an account of the lives they had lived and the deaths they had died. Orhan stood before the graves. He stood alone, having ordered his men to rest, having sent even Evrenos away with a look that brooked no argument. He needed this moment. He needed to stand before these men who had died for him, who had followed him into this valley because they believed in what he was trying to build, who had paid the ultimate price for their belief. He spoke to them, not aloud. The words were formed in his mind and directed outward toward the graves, toward the spirits that he hoped were still somehow present, still somehow aware. "I will not forget you," he said silently. "I will not let your sacrifice be in vain. I will build what you died for. I will make it strong. I will make it last. And when I stand before Allah on the day of judgment, I will tell him about each of you. I will tell him that you were brave. I will tell him that you were faithful. I will tell him that you were mine and that I was proud to lead you." The wind stirred, the grass bent. The last light of the sun touched the grave markers and made them glow for a brief moment, before the darkness came and swallowed everything. Orhan turned and walked back to the camp. He ate the food that was placed before him without tasting it. He drank the water that was offered without feeling it. He lay down on the pallet that had been prepared in his tent and stared at the canvas ceiling and waited for sleep that would not come. He thought of Bursa, he thought of his mother waiting. He thought of Nilüfer holding their son. He thought of Aspersa, the stranger who was now his wife. He thought of the palace that was his home but that often felt like a cage, a gilded cage whose bars were made of responsibility and expectation, and the endless demands of a state that was always hungry, always needing, always requiring more than any single man could give. And he thought of his father. He thought of Osman, who had built the foundation upon which everything now stood. He thought of the stories he had heard as a child, the stories of how Osman had started with nothing, a small tribe in a small territory, surrounded by enemies who were larger and stronger and better established. He thought of how Osman had defied the odds, had conquered and expanded and transformed a tribe into a Beylik and a Beylik into the seed of an empire. He thought of the dream that had been passed from father to son like a sacred torch, a flame that must never be allowed to go out. "I am trying, father," he thought. "I am trying to be what you need me to be, but the weight is heavy, the enemies are many, the task is greater than any one man can bear." He did not expect an answer. The dead do not speak, no matter how much the living wish they would. But somehow in the silence of his tent, in the darkness that surrounded him, he felt something. Not a voice, not a presence. Just a warmth that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere, a warmth that settled over him like a blanket, that eased the tension in his muscles and the turbulence in his mind. And finally, for the first time in days, Orhan slept. The march began the next morning, just as the sun was clearing the eastern hills, painting the world in shades of pink and gold that seemed to promise better days ahead. The army formed up with the efficiency of long practice, each man knowing his place, each unit knowing its position in the column, each horse and wagon and piece of equipment finding its proper location in the long snake that would wind its way back to Bursa. Orhan rode at the head of the column as was proper, as was expected. His wound had been properly dressed now, the cut on his arm cleaned and bandaged, and already beginning the slow process of healing that the body performs without conscious direction. He sat straight in the saddle, his eyes forward, his face showing none of the exhaustion that still lived in his bones. A sultan does not show weakness. A sultan projects strength, even when the strength is a performance, even when the reality behind the performance is far more complicated than anyone watching could imagine. The journey to Bursa would take several days. The army moved slowly, burdened by wounded and wagons and the general heaviness that follows any major engagement. They stopped frequently to rest the horses and tend to the injured, and allow the men to recover from the ordeal they had been through. And at each stop, Orhan walked among his soldiers, speaking to them, acknowledging their sacrifice, thanking them for their service with words that were simple, but that meant everything to men who had risked their lives for him. He learned their names, he learned their stories, he learned about the families they had left behind, the wives and children and parents who waited for their return. He learned about their dreams, the things they hoped to do when the fighting was finally over, the lands they wanted to farm, the trades they wanted to practice, the lives they wanted to live in the peaceful empire that all of them hoped this war would eventually create. He learned, too, about those who had not returned. The soldiers told him about their fallen comrades, the men who had been beside them one moment and gone the next, the friends who had saved their lives and lost their own, the brothers in arms who would never see their families again. They spoke these names with reverence, with grief, with the particular combination of sorrow and pride that belongs to those who have witnessed sacrifice and survived to tell about it. Orhan listened. He listened to every name, every story, every memory. He listened and he remembered, and he added each one to the collection that he carried within him, the collection that grew heavier with each battle but that he would not put down, could not put down, because putting it down would be a betrayal of those who had given everything. On the third day of the march, as the column was winding through a forest that marked the halfway point between the valley and Bursa, a scout came riding back with news. Riders were approaching from the south, Ottoman riders, bearing the insignia of the garrison at Bursa. Orhan called a halt. He rode forward to meet the approaching riders, accompanied by Evrenos and a small escort. The forest pressed in on either side, its trees ancient and tall, their branches interlocking overhead to form a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. The riders emerged from the shadows of the trees and stopped before the Sultan. Their leader dismounted and knelt, his head bowed, his hand pressed to his heart in the gesture of respect that protocol demanded. "My Sultan," he said, "I bring messages from Bursa. The palace celebrates your victory. The people line the streets to welcome your return," and he hesitated, his voice dropping slightly. "There are other matters that require your attention." Orhan gestured for the man to rise. "Speak," he said, "what matters?" The rider rose but kept his eyes lowered. "There have been difficulties in the palace, my Sultan, tensions among the women, incidents that required the intervention of Malhun Khatan. Nothing that threatens the security of the state." But he trailed off, uncertain how to continue, uncertain how much a sultan wanted to hear about the domestic troubles that simmered beneath the surface of his household. Orhan's expression did not change. He had expected this. He had known, even as he rode toward the valley, that the alliance he had created through his marriage to Aspersa would generate friction within his household. He had known that Nilüfer would feel threatened, that the other women would take sides, that the delicate balance of his home would be disturbed by the introduction of a new element. He had known all of this, and he had made the marriage anyway because the political benefits outweighed the personal costs, because a sultan does not have the luxury of considering only his own comfort when making decisions that affect the fate of nations. But knowing something intellectually and feeling its weight emotionally are two different things. He felt the weight now, pressing down on him alongside all the other weights he carried, the dead soldiers, the unfinished war, the endless demands of the state. He felt it and he accepted it because acceptance was the only option, because there was no one else who could carry what he carried, because the throne he sat upon had been built for one and could not be shared. "We will address these matters when we arrive," he said. "For now, continue to Bursa and announce that the Sultan returns tomorrow. Prepare the people for our arrival." The rider bowed. "Yes, my Sultan," and he mounted his horse and rode away, disappearing into the forest with his companions, carrying the news that would set Bursa into another frenzy of preparation. Orhan sat on his horse for a long moment after the riders had gone, staring at the place where they had vanished, his mind already traveling ahead to the palace, to the challenges that waited for him there, to the battles that would have to be fought with words instead of swords, with diplomacy instead of strategy, with the subtle weapons of presence and authority that a sultan must master if he is to rule not just his state but his household. Evrenos spoke. "The women," he said simply. His voice carried a note of sympathy that came from his own experience of marriage, his own understanding of the complexities that arise when multiple wives share a single husband. Orhan did not respond immediately. He continued to stare at the forest, at the trees that stood like silent witnesses to his contemplation. Finally he said, "The battlefield is simple. You see your enemy, you fight your enemy, you defeat your enemy or you die trying. But the palace," he shook his head slightly, "the palace is a battlefield where you cannot always see your enemy, where the weapons are invisible, where victory and defeat are measured in glances and silences, and the things that are not said." Evrenos nodded. "It is said," he offered, "that a wise man learns to fight on all battlefields, not just the ones where swords are drawn." Orhan almost smiled. Almost. The expression flickered across his face and then disappeared, replaced by the mask of composure that he had learned to wear so long ago that he sometimes forgot it was a mask at all. "Wisdom," he said. "If only wisdom were as easy to acquire as soldiers and horses and weapons. If only it could be purchased in the marketplace or claimed as the spoils of war." He turned his horse. He rode back to the column. He gave the order to continue the march. And the army moved on, carrying its wounded and its memories and its sultan, all of them traveling toward a home that was both a refuge and a challenge, a place of rest and a place of battle, a destination that was also a beginning. The next day they emerged from the forest and saw Bursa spread before them, the city climbing the slopes of the mountain, its walls gleaming in the morning light, its minarets reaching toward the sky like fingers pointing toward God. The sight of the city after days of marching through wilderness and battlefield struck the soldiers with a force that was almost physical. Some of them cheered, some of them wept. Some simply stared, drinking in the vision of home with eyes that had seen too much death and needed desperately to see something that spoke of life. Orhan felt it too, the pull of home, the longing for familiar walls and familiar faces, and the particular quality of peace that can only be found in a place where you belong. But he felt something else as well, something that accompanied the longing like a shadow accompanies light. He felt the weight of what awaited him within those walls, the responsibilities and the tensions and the decisions that would have to be made. A sultan is never truly home, he thought. A sultan carries his kingdom with him wherever he goes, and the kingdom is always demanding, always hungry, always requiring more than any single man can give. The gates of the city opened before them. The streets were lined with people just as the messenger had promised, crowds of citizens who had come to welcome their sultan home, to celebrate the victory that had been won, to see with their own eyes the man who had ridden into battle and returned alive. They threw flowers, they shouted praises, they reached out to touch the legs of his horse as though touching him would transfer some of his victory to them, some of his strength, some of his blessing. Orhan rode through the crowds with his head held high, acknowledging the cheers with nods and small gestures, playing the role that was expected of him, being the symbol that his people needed him to be. But inside, behind the mask, he was already thinking about what came next, the audiences he would have to give, the reports he would have to hear, the decisions he would have to make, and the women. The women who waited for him in the palace, each one carrying her own expectations, her own needs, her own claim on his time and his attention and his heart. The palace came into view. It rose above the city like a crown upon a head, its walls solid and reassuring, its towers reaching toward the sky with the confidence of a structure that has been built to last. The gates opened, the courtyard appeared. And there, standing in formation, were the people who made up his household, the servants and the guards and the administrators and the women, all of them arranged according to protocol, all of them waiting for the moment when he would dismount and walk among them and the ritual of homecoming would be complete. He saw Malhun first. His mother stood at the head of the assembly, her posture straight, her face calm, her eyes carrying the particular brightness that comes from tears that have been held back for days and are now threatening to fall. He saw the pride in her expression, the relief, the love that she would never speak aloud, but that was written in every line of her face. He saw Nilüfer next, standing slightly behind Malhun, holding Murad in her arms. The baby was awake, his eyes wide and curious, his small hands grasping at the air as though trying to catch the sunlight that streamed into the courtyard. Nilüfer's face was a study in controlled emotion, joy at his return warring with the tension that had accumulated during his absence, the tension that would need to be addressed but not now, not yet, not in front of everyone. And he saw Espersa. She stood apart from the others, not quite included in the family grouping but not quite excluded either, occupying a middle ground that spoke of her uncertain status, her provisional acceptance, the work that still needed to be done before she would truly belong. Her face was composed, carefully arranged into an expression of welcome that was correct in every detail, but that could not hide the anxiety beneath, the fear of how she would be received, the uncertainty of where she stood in the constellation of his household. Orhan dismounted. He walked toward his family with the measured pace of a man who knows that every step is being watched, every gesture analyzed, every expression interpreted. He reached Malhun first. He took her hand and kissed it as he had before his departure, completing the circle, closing the loop that had begun when he rode out and was now ending as he returned. Malhun said nothing. She did not need to. Her eyes said everything, the relief and the pride and the love that had sustained her through the days of waiting. She placed her other hand over his, holding him for a moment, and in that moment the bond between mother and son was renewed, strengthened, confirmed. Then Orhan moved to Nilüfer. He looked at his wife, at the mother of his son, at the woman who had been his choice before politics had required him to make other choices. He saw the complexity in her eyes, the joy at his return and the hurt that had accumulated during his absence and the fear of what his new marriage would mean for her position. He reached out and touched his son's face, feeling the soft skin beneath his fingers, feeling the warmth of life that was also his life, his legacy, his future. "My son," he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything he had fought for, everything he had risked, everything he had sacrificed. He had ridden into battle with this child's face in his mind, with this child's future as his motivation, with the determination that this child would inherit an empire worth inheriting. Nilüfer said, "Welcome home, my sultan." Her voice was formal, correct, revealing nothing of the turmoil beneath. There would be time for real conversation later, in private, away from the watching eyes and the listening ears. For now, protocol ruled and protocol demanded composure. And then Orhan moved to Espersa. He saw her stiffen slightly as he approached, saw the uncertainty flicker across her face before she controlled it. He saw how hard she was trying, how desperately she wanted to do the right thing, to be the right thing, to find her place in a world that was not her own. He stopped before her. He looked at her with eyes that saw more than she wanted to reveal, that read the struggle behind her composure, the loneliness behind her formality, the determination that Malhun had planted and that was now slowly beginning to grow. "Welcome home, my sultan," she said, echoing Nilufer's words using the same formal tone, the same correct language. Orhan nodded. "It is good to be home," he said. And then, in a gesture that surprised everyone watching, he added, "I hope you have been well cared for in my absence." The words were small, a simple inquiry that protocol did not require but that consideration suggested. But to Aspersa they were enormous. They were acknowledgement. They were recognition. They were a signal that she existed in his awareness, that her well-being mattered to him, that she was not merely a clause in a treaty but a person whose experience he cared about. "I have been my sultan," she said. "Your mother has been most kind." Orhan glanced at Malhun, seeing the slight nod that confirmed Aspersa's words, seeing the approval in his mother's eyes. Something had happened in his absence, some shift in the dynamics of the household, some change that he would need to understand. But that could wait. For now, the homecoming was complete. The rituals had been observed, the circle had been closed. "Come," Malhun said, addressing the assembly. "The Sultan is home, let us prepare for the evening meal." The household dispersed with the orderly efficiency of long practice. Servants returned to their duties. Guards resumed their positions. The administrators departed to prepare the reports that would be delivered later, the accounts of what had happened in the Sultan's absence, the decisions that had been made, the issues that had arisen, the matters that required his attention. And Orhan was left standing in the courtyard, surrounded by family and household, but somehow alone, the only one who truly understood the weight he carried, the only one who knew how heavy the crown sat upon his head, the only one who could see the road ahead and the battles that still waited along it. The war was not over. The war would never be over. The enemies who had fled the valley were regrouping even now, nursing their hatred, planning their revenge. The allies who had stood beside him today might become enemies tomorrow, their loyalties shifting with the winds of advantage. The empire he was building would face challenges he could not yet imagine, threats that had not yet emerged, crises that would test everything he believed and everything he had built. And within his own household, other wars were being fought, wars of position and precedence, of love and jealousy, of belonging and exclusion. These wars would not be won with swords. They would be won with patience and wisdom and the subtle application of presence and authority. They would be won slowly over time through countless small victories and inevitable setbacks, through the gradual building of trust and the careful management of conflict. Orhan looked up at the sky, at the sun that was now directly overhead, at the light that poured down upon his city and his palace and his people. He thought of his father, of the dream that had been passed to him, of the burden that he had accepted and could not put down. "I will continue," he thought. "I will build, I will fight, I will endure, because that is what sultans do. That is what the sons of Osman do. We continue until we can continue no more, and then we pass the burden to the next generation and they continue, and so it goes until the dream is complete or the world ends, whichever comes first." He turned and walked into the palace. The doors closed behind him. And outside, in the streets of Bursa, the people celebrated their sultan's return, their voices rising in songs of praise and gratitude, their hearts full of hope for the future, their faith in the man who led them unshaken by the trials that had been faced and the trials that were still to come. The war was not over. But for today, for this moment, there was peace. And peace, however temporary, however fragile, was something to be treasured. Because tomorrow the war would resume. Tomorrow the enemies would return. Tomorrow the battles would begin again. But that was tomorrow. Today the Sultan was home. And that was enough. For now. March began beneath a sky the color of old steel, and the road north drank the sound of hooves as if it did not wish to remember who passed over it. Behind Arhan Sahib the bridge receded into distance like a closed chapter, and yet its smoke clung to their cloaks, a reminder that Shahanshah had already tried to turn the very elements into soldiers. The river's whisper faded, replaced by the hush of trees and the low murmur of an army moving with purpose that did not ask permission from the earth. Arhan Sahib rode at the front, not because he sought to be seen, but because he wanted the road itself to understand. This was no wandering host, no plunder band, no reckless pursuit. This was judgment traveling in disciplined ranks. Mustafa kept the column tight, spacing measured, no gaps for raiders to slip through. Mahmud's archers moved near the center where arrows could be protected from rain and sudden theft. Abdul Rahman rode along the flank, lips moving in remembrance, feeding men's hearts the only bread that does not run out. Valadios, bound with cloth and stubbornness, rode despite pain, his face pale but his eyes alive with a fury that refused to be humbled by blood loss. Daimir Khan remained close, his mind always hunting for angles. Tamir Boga scouted ahead with a small screen of riders, and Altadin Sahib faded in and out of tree lines like a shadow that had learned to breathe. Jarkata Sahib held the rear, watching for the enemy's favorite trick, striking where a commander's eyes no longer reach. And ahead, far ahead, Tarhan rode like a blade thrown into darkness, his small group silent, his shield strapped, his wounded arm wrapped tight, his gaze searching the world for the trail of hostages and the shape of Shahanshah's retreat. The forest thickened as they advanced, pines rose like spears, underbrush grabbed at boots. The air smelled of resin and damp soil, and somewhere a wolf howled as if announcing that the land itself had begun to recognize war's scent again. The road narrowed into a corridor between ridges. It was the kind of corridor a clever enemy loves, one where ambush becomes easy and retreat becomes a question asked too late. Orhan Sahib slowed the column with a raised hand. "Zarkin," he said, voice calm but carrying, "bring your scouts forward." Zarkin's face tightened at the sound of his name, humiliation still fresh from suspicion, but he obeyed, moving with stiff discipline. He returned with 2 men, eyes scanning. "The corridor bends," Zarkin reported. "A ravine on the left, thick brush on the right, good ground for archers." Orhan Sahib watched him as he spoke, watching not only the report but the breath, the eyes, the slight tremor that can betray a man's hidden intent. He found only tension, not deceit. But tension can also be guilt, and guilt can also be fear of being wrongly judged. War forces leaders to read faces as if they were maps, and maps often lie. Orhan Sahib nodded once, "Then we do not walk into it like blind men." He lifted his voice to Mustafa, "Send Tamir Boga wide left, Altadin Sahib wide right, no one enters the bend until the brush is counted." Mustafa obeyed and the column halted, men dismounting quietly, shields coming up. Mahmud's archers moved into positions where they could answer a sudden volley. Abdul Rahman murmured a short supplication and men answered softly, a wave of faith moving through ranks like steady breath. Minutes passed, heavy with waiting. A bird lifted suddenly from the brush ahead, startled, and the sound of its wings was sharp in the silence. Then, from the right, Altadin Sahib's signal came, a low whistle like a snake's breath. "Ambush!" Arrows hissed from the brush, but not into a marching column, into a prepared wall of shields. Shafts struck wood and clattered down. A man grunted as an arrow found the gap at his shoulder, but he did not fall. He was dragged back and bound quickly. Mahmud's men answered, firing into the brush where silhouettes flickered, and cries rose as arrows found flesh. Then the enemy surged out, not in a full army rush, but in a sharp strike meant to cut the head of the column, fast raiders with curved blades and faces wrapped, hopping to kill captains and vanish before the main force could swallow them. Orhan Sahib stepped forward into the press with controlled violence. He did not chase. He cut what came near and held the line. Damir Khan moved alongside, spear thrusting in short, brutal jabs. Mustafa commanded the shield line, absorbing the impact like stone absorbs rain. Altadin Sahib's flanking men struck from the right, blades flashing in close quarters, and Tamir Boga returned from the left with riders who slammed into the raiders' rear, trapping them between shield wall and horse hooves. The raiders realized too late that their corridor had become a box. A raider captain, taller than the rest, rushed toward Orhan Sahib with a shout, blade aimed for the commander's throat. Damir Khan stepped in and caught the strike on his spear haft, but the blow splintered wood. The raider captain pressed, snarling. Orhan Sahib's sword rose once, clean and final, and the captain fell with his shout still half-formed in his mouth. The remaining raiders tried to flee into the brush. Altadin Sahib cut them down with a cold patience, and those who surrendered were bound, stripped of weapons, and forced to their knees in the mud. Orhan Sahib walked among them, eyes like a judge's. "Who sent you?" One raider spat, "The crown." Orhan Sahib's voice was low, "Shahanshah." The raider's lips trembled, but he nodded. Orhan Sahib crouched, gripping the man's chin, forcing his gaze up. "Where are the hostages?" The raider swallowed. "North Road near the Black Hill, taken into the keep." Orhan Sahib's grip tightened. "How many?" The raider hesitated. Damir Khan's blade hovered near his throat like a question. "Two," the raider whispered, "2 children alive." Orhan Sahib released him and stood, the weight in his chest deepening. Alive meant leverage. Alive meant Shahanshah would use them like a shield made of innocence. Orhan Sahib ordered the raiders executed quickly, not in cruelty, but in refusal to allow these knives to return to darkness. Their bodies were left in the corridor bend as a message to any other band sent to bleed the march. This road had teeth now. The column moved again deeper into forest, and the day slowly bled toward dusk. Shadows lengthened. The air cooled. Smoke from distant burnings drifted occasionally through tree lines, reminding them that while they marched north, their land behind still risked fire. As evening approached, Tarhan returned. He came at speed, horse-blown, eyes burning. He dismounted before Orhan Sahib and went down on one knee, not in weakness, but in the discipline of delivering grave truth. "Sahib," he said, voice tight, "they are in Caragirl Keep. I saw the walls." Orhan Sahib's heart tightened. "And the hostages?" Tarhan's jaw clenched. "Two children, as the captive said. I saw them briefly, taken through the inner gate, guarded, and I saw something else." Orhan Sahib leaned in. "Speak." Tarhan's eyes narrowed, the memory sharp. "Shahanshah's men are not alone there. There are hired blades, foreign tongues, and there is a new banner flying above the keep, not the king's banner, a black cloth with a pale mark, a sign meant to say, 'No mercy.'" Faladios hissed through pain. "He declares himself beyond law." Abdul Rahman murmured, "No one is beyond Allah's law." Tarhan continued, "The road to the keep is watched. 2 outposts, one at the cedar ridge, one at the stone shrine. They have pits and spikes and archers placed high. They expect us." Orhan Sahib nodded slowly. "Good, let them expect and still be surprised." He turned to Mustafa. "We camp before night fully falls, not close enough to be seen, not far enough to lose time. No fires visible, men eat cold, guards doubled." Mustafa obeyed. The army slipped into a concealed hollow among trees and rocks. Tents were not raised, cloaks became beds, steel stayed close. The camp was a sleeping animal with eyes open. Orhan Sahib gathered his captains in the dim, where a single covered lamp barely breathed light. Faces leaned in. Mustafa, Damir Khan, Mahmud, Abdul Rahman, Tamir Boga, Altadin Sahib, Jarkata Sahib, Faladios grim and pale, Zarkin tight with restrained anger, Kulid's watchful, Al-Aliadin Sahib quiet and strained, and Tarhan standing like a wall. Orhan Sahib spoke low, each word placed with intent. "Caragirl Keep is stone. We do not break stone with anger, we break it with hunger and fear. First we cut its throat, no supplies in, no men out, we encircle." Damir Khan nodded. "The ridges." Orhan Sahib looked to Tarhan. "Describe the ground." Tarhan traced in dirt with a dagger tip. "The keep sits on a black hill, one main gate facing south, a smaller postern gate on the east side near a rocky drop. The west wall is steep, hard to climb. There is a spring inside the keep, but it is shallow. They draw extra water from a cistern fed by channels from the slope." Al-Aliadin Sahib leaned in, eyes narrowing. "Channels can be cut." Orhan Sahib nodded. "Yes, if we cut their water, we cut their patience." Tamir Boga spoke, voice blunt. "And the hostages?" Silence tightened. Faladios, fist clenched. Abdul Rahman lowered his gaze in sorrowful prayer. Orhan Sahib finally answered, and his voice was heavy. "We do not storm blindly while children stand behind stone. Shahanshah wants us to become monsters so he can call us monsters. We will not give him that." Zarkin's voice rose bitterly. "Then we sit while he laughs behind walls." Orhan Sahib's gaze snapped to him, sharp as a drawn blade. "You will not speak to me of laughter while you have not yet proven your loyalty clean of doubt." Zarkin stiffened, face flushing with anger, but he bowed his head. Orhan Sahib returned to the plan. "Tonight we take the outposts, quietly, no horns, no fires. Tarhan will lead the strike at the stone shrine outpost. Damir Khan will take Cedar Ridge. Altadin Sahib will move to the east wall and find the postern gate. If there is a weakness, he will smell it. Mahmud remains with the main body to answer arrows if they see us. Mustafa holds formation. Jarkata Sahib guards the rear. Abdul Rahman will remain central. His voice will steady men when the dark begins to whisper." Tarhan nodded once. "As you command." Damir Khan's eyes gleamed. "We will take their eyes." Orhan Sahib added, "No prisoners unless they yield quickly. We cannot drag chains tonight." They moved when the night deepened. The forest swallowed them. No torches, no loud prayers, only the quiet breath of men who knew that one misplaced foot could turn a raid into a slaughter. Tarhan's group slipped toward the stone shrine outpost. The shrine sat beside the road like an old witness, carved with worn symbols, surrounded by a low stone wall. Shahanshah's men had placed a watch there, 10 soldiers, perhaps 12, with a small fire and a crude barricade of logs. Tarhan observed from brush, eyes cold. He raised a hand and 2 men crawled wide, circling. Tarhan moved forward with 3, stepping in silence, sword ready. The firelight made sentries' faces visible, sleepy, arrogant, believing the keep's stone made them untouchable. Tarhin surged. His blade flashed once and a sentry fell before sound could form. Another turned, mouth opening, but Tarhin slammed his shield into the man's face, crushing breath. A third grabbed a spear and tried to thrust. Tarhin parried and cut the man's hand, then finished him with a short thrust to the chest. His men struck the others simultaneously, knives and swords working in the dark like efficient inevitability. One soldier tried to run toward the keep, shouting. Tarhin threw a dagger. It struck the runner's back and he fell in the dirt, the shout dying into a choking gasp. The outpost fire was smothered with cloaks and earth. The barricade was dismantled. Bodies were dragged into brush. Silence returned as if nothing had happened except for the smell of blood which the night cannot hide. Meanwhile, Daimir Khan took the Cedar Ridge outpost with brutal speed, cutting down archers before they could loose arrows. He returned with 2 enemy horses and a bundle of arrows, spoils that would feed Mahmud's bows later. Altadin Sahib reached the east wall slope and found what he sought. The postern gate's hidden path, narrow and rocky, guarded by only a few men who believed the steepness was protection enough. Altadin Sahib did not challenge the gate. He watched it, measured it, then withdrew into darkness to report. By the time the raid forces returned to the main body, the road to Caragirl Keep had been blinded. Shahanshah's early warning eyes were gone. Orhan Sahib listened to reports without visible satisfaction. Good, he said only, now the siege begins. They advanced at first light. The Black Hill rose ahead like a clenched fist. Caragirl Keep sat atop it, walls dark and old, stones stained by time and smoke. A banner flew above black cloth, pale mark as Tarhin described, an insult flapping in the wind like an invitation to despair. As Orhan Sahib's army emerged from the tree line into the open ground before the hill, horns sounded from the keep. Archers appeared on the walls, their bows raised. A voice shouted from above, sharp and cruel. Orhan Sahib, you come at last. Shahanshah's voice carried by distance and pride. Orhan Sahib rode forward until he was close enough that both sides could see each other clearly, but far enough that an arrow's flight would be a deliberate act rather than a reflex. Shahanshah stood on the battlement, cloaked guards around him. His face was tight, his eyes burning with the fury of a king whose dignity had been bruised by smoke, raids, and stubborn resistance. He lifted a hand, and 2 small figures were brought forward. Children. One boy, one girl, bound but alive, faces streaked with dirt and fear. The sight struck Orhan Sahib's army like a stone thrown into a quiet pond. Men murmured angrily. Faladios snarled. Mustafa's jaw clenched so hard it trembled. Abdul Rahman's eyes closed briefly, lips moving in prayer. Shahanshah's voice rang out, triumphant and vile. Behold your mercy, behold your justice. Will you storm my walls now, Orhan Sahib? Will your arrows fly through children to reach my crown? Orhan Sahib's chest tightened, but his face remained composed. He raised his voice, and it carried with calm authority that cut through the enemy's gloating. Shahanshah, he called, you stand behind children because you cannot stand behind honor. You have shown every man on these walls what kind of king you are. Shahanshah laughed, and you have shown every man behind you what kind of commander you are, a commander who cannot save the innocent. Orhan Sahib's voice lowered, and in that lowering was danger. I will save them, and I will take your keep. And when your men see that your threats do not protect you, they will ask why they bleed for a crown that hides behind little hands. Shahanshah's smile thinned. Then come, starve outside my stone. I have water, I have walls, I have time. Orhan Sahib's eyes narrowed. Time belongs to Allah. He turned away without further words because the siege was not won by shouting at stone. It was won by turning the land itself into a tightening fist. He arranged the encirclement with the patience of a man building a grave. Mustafa held the southern approach with shields and spears, preventing sorties. Daimir Khan took the western slope with riders positioned to intercept any attempt to slip out. Tamir Boga held the eastern approach near the rocky drop, ready to respond to the postern gate's hidden path. Altadin Sahib took men into the surrounding forest to hunt foragers and to cut any messengers trying to escape. Mahmud placed archers behind earthen berms, their arrows aimed not for glory but for any head foolish enough to rise above battlements. Jarkata Sahib secured the rear and the supply line of Orhan's own army, because a siege can starve the besieger as easily as the besieged. Al-Aliaddin Sahib was brought to Orhan Sahib's side and Orhan's voice was low. "Write a message." Al-Aliaddin Sahib blinked to Shahanshah. Orhan Sahib nodded, yes, not pleading, not bargaining, a declaration. Al-Aliaddin Sahib's ink hand shook, but he wrote under Orhan's dictation. "Your walls cannot hide you from Allah. Release the innocent and you may live to repent. Keep them as shields and you will be remembered as a king who used children as armor." The message was tied to an arrow and shot into the keep's courtyard, landing where men could see it. Shahanshah's laughter was heard faintly from the walls, but behind that laughter Orhan Sahib listened for the quieter sound of doubt spreading among the keep's defenders. Then the real work began, cutting water. Tarhan led a small force along the slope to find the cistern channels described by scouts. They found stone-lined grooves running down the hill, feeding into hidden inlets. Tarhan's men blocked them with clay and rock, diverting the flow away from the keep. Water pooled elsewhere, wasted into earth, a small thing seemingly, but in siege small things become death. Inside the keep men would soon taste thirst. Shahanshah answered not with surrender but with poison of his own, psychological warfare. At dusk, as the sky bruised purple, the keep's gates opened slightly and a drummer stepped out with 2 guards. The drummer beat a slow rhythm, mocking, steady, meant to disturb sleep. Above, Shahanshah's voice called down again, loud enough for Orhan's camp to hear. "I will feed the children at dawn," he shouted, "if Orhan Sahib kneels." A murmur of fury ran through Orhan's men. Some shouted curses, others gripped weapons so tightly their knuckles whitened. Abdul Rahman lifted his voice, calming the rising storm with verses about patience under trial. Orhan Sahib did not shout back. He did not play Shahanshah's game of public bargaining. He ordered Mahmud quietly, 1 arrow, the drummer. Mahmud's best archer drew, aimed, and loosed. The arrow flew clean, struck the drummer's chest, and he fell backward into dust, drum rolling away and stopping with a dull thud. The guards dragged the corpse back toward the gate, faces pale. The gate slammed shut. Silence returned, deeper for having been briefly broken. That night the siege tightened. Fires in Orhan's camp were kept low, men ate sparingly. Guards rotated. Al-Aliaddin Sahib returned with news. 2 messengers had tried to slip out of the keep under cover of darkness through a sewer channel. He caught them in the reeds and cut them down. One carried a sealed letter to an unknown ally. Orhan Sahib took the letter, eyes narrowing. "He still tries ink." Al-Aliaddin Sahib examined the seal. His voice was strained. "This seal is not Shahanshah's." Orhan Sahib's gaze sharpened. "Then whose?" Al-Aliaddin Sahib swallowed. "It is the mark of a mercenary house, hired blades, the ones Tarhan saw." Orhan Sahib nodded slowly. "So Shahanshah does not only rely on fear, he relies on coin." Faladios, sitting near the fire, snarled, "Coin melts in fire." Orhan Sahib's eyes stayed on the dark keep. "Yes, but first we must make the mercenaries doubt their payment." The next day, Orhan Sahib ordered a tactic of quiet cruelty against the mercenaries' confidence. He had Daimir Khan hang captured mercenary insignias on stakes outside bow range and leave beneath them the bodies of those who had tried to escape, faces turned toward the keep like mute accusation. No shouting, no insults, only proof that escape routes were watched and that the net was real. Then he sent Abdul Rahman to walk the lines and speak loudly enough for the keep's walls to hear. "Allah does not forget the oppressed," Abdul Rahman called, voice steady. "Walls do not save oppressors. Hunger walks through stone, thirst climbs towers, and betrayal lives closest to the crown." Inside the keep, men listened whether they wished to or not. On the 3rd day, Shahanshah attempted a sortie. At dawn's pale edge, the south gate burst open and 50 soldiers rushed out, shields up, hopping to break the siege line, burn the berms, and retreat before Orhan could swallow them. Their leader was fierce, armored, carrying a red pennant, Burhan Faladios, personal rival of Yaqid, now with his own grudges burning, though Yaqid was dead. Faladios saw the man and his eyes flared with recognition and hatred. "That one," Faladios rasped, spitting into dust. "He served Shahanshah even when Yaqid did not. He is called Burhan Faladios by some to mock me, to steal my name." Orhan Sahib's gaze tightened. Names again. Shahanshah's favorite poison, confusion of identity, blurring of honor. Mustafa's line absorbed the sortie, shields locking. Spears thrust. The attackers slammed into the wall of men and tried to force an opening. Mahmud's archers fired into the sortie's flanks, arrows striking unshielded sides. Tamir Boga's riders swept around and cut off retreat, not fully but enough to make the sortie feel trapped. The enemy leader Barhan Faladios, the name thief, charged directly toward Faladios, recognizing him as the wounded lion and perhaps hoping to finish him, to crush Orhan's morale by killing a fierce commander in full view. Faladios rose despite pain, sword shaking slightly in his grip, eyes blazing. "He is mine," he growled. Orhan Sahib caught his arm briefly. "Do not die for pride." Faladios' voice was raw. "This is not pride, this is my name." Then Faladios stepped forward into open space before the line, where men could see, where arrows could fly. The enemy leader saw him and laughed, raising his blade. "So you still breathe," the man shouted. "I will carve your name into mud." Faladios answered with a single line, low but carrying, "You will not carry my name to your grave." They met. Steel clashed, sharp and immediate. Faladios moved with wounded stiffness but terrifying intent. The enemy leader was fresh, strong, confident, swinging heavy cuts meant to exploit Faladios' weakened side. Faladios parried, stepped back, let the weight pass, then countered with short, precise strikes aimed at wrists and knees rather than armor. He was fighting not to impress but to end. The enemy leader feinted, then drove a thrust toward Faladios' wounded side. Faladios twisted, the tip scraping armor and cloth, pain flashing across his face, but he did not fall. He grabbed the enemy's forearm with his free hand, locking it, pulling him close. Their helmets nearly touched. Faladios spoke through clenched teeth. "You serve a king who hides behind children." The enemy leader snarled, "I serve coin." Faladios' eyes burned. "Then be paid." He drove his sword upward under the enemy's arm where plate met leather. The enemy leader gasped, his strength draining into shock. Faladios shoved him away and the man stumbled, fell to his knees, then collapsed face first in dust. A roar rose from Orhan's men, not of joy, but of renewed resolve. The sortie's attackers faltered as their leader fell. Mustafa's line pushed, Tamir Boga's riders struck, and the sortie broke, retreating toward the gate in disorder. Orhan Sahib did not allow them to run cleanly back into safety. "Arrows," he commanded. Mahmud's archers loosed into the retreat, cutting down those who lagged. Men fell near the gate, creating a pile that hindered closure. For a heartbeat, Orhan Sahib saw opportunity. The gate momentarily choked. But then he saw the children on the wall again, moved forward by Shahanshah's guards, their small figures framed against stone. A trap. If Orhan Sahib rushed the gate now, Shahanshah would claim the children were killed in the press, and the moral stain would cling to Orhan's name like tar. Orhan Sahib lifted his hand sharply. "Hold, do not rush." His men obeyed, though their blood screamed for the gate. The enemy dragged bodies inward and slammed the gate shut. The opportunity vanished like smoke, leaving behind only the taste of restraint. Faladios, breathing hard, swayed. Turhan rushed to him, supporting his elbow. "You should not have," Turhan murmured. Faladios' eyes were wild with pain and triumph mixed. "He stole my name," I took his breath. Orhan Sahib watched Faladios and nodded once. "You reminded them we still have lions." That night, thirst began to speak louder inside the keep. Orhan Sahib's scouts reported fewer torches on the walls, fewer arrogant shouts. A man's courage shrivels when his tongue sticks to his mouth. Shahanshah responded with a new cruelty. At midnight, a small door in the east wall opened and a body was thrown out, a villager, dead, tied to a board marked with soot and ash. Around his neck hung a crude sign carved into wood, "Withdraw or more will follow." Orhan Sahib stared at the corpse under torchlight, his face unreadable. He knelt, untied the sign, and handed it to Abdul Rahman. "Bury him with honor," Orhan Sahib said quietly, "and tell the men, Shahanshah throws bodies because his hands are empty." Abdul Rahman nodded, eyes wet but steady. Then Alauddin Sahib returned with a whisper that cut deeper than any arrow. "Sahib," Alauddin Sahib said, "the postern gate. It opens at night for a moment, just long enough to pass a water skin or a message. They are desperate for water. They send small groups down the rocky drop to find seepage." Orhan Sahib's eyes sharpened. "How many?" 3 or 4 at a time," Alauddin Sahib said, "always guarded by 2 mercenaries." Turhan leaned in. "We can take them, capture one, make him speak." Orhan Sahib nodded slowly. "Yes, tonight." They prepared a trap near the rocky drop. Men concealed themselves in shadows and brush, faces darkened, breath controlled. Tarhan led the capture force with a rope and a gag because a prisoner whose screams becomes